Not really camping, but as kids, we lived in a new neighborhood. It was next to about 400 acres of woods and old farmland. There were several abandoned houses and barns, equipment, and random junk. It was great to grow up there, as we spent nearly every day exploring the entire area. But there was one house off the main road. But about 200 yards into the woods, it looked abandoned, but a woman lived there. We found out the hard way by trying to get into the house one day, and she came out screaming at us to get the hell off her property. She was scary looking. She wore a dirty dress and had gross stringy hair, and like she hadn't taken a shower for years. She looked to be in her 30s. Needless to say, we stayed away from her most of the time. We also never told our parents because, well, we knew they wouldn't ever let us play back there anymore. We did go back there sometimes though. We named her Crazy Mary, and we'd spy on her and dare each other to get as close as possible. Even though we never got close, about 100 feet from her house. About 10 to 12 years later, I am home from college and my mom tells me about how they took this woman to the mental hospital. Apparently, she lived there this whole time with her dead mother and father propped up in their chairs in the living room. They figured the parents were dead for roughly 10 to 15 years, but died of natural causes, and Mary had propped them up in the chairs after they had died. That meant that they were probably freshly dead when we got chased away by Crazy Mary. Camping at Yellowstone a few years back. He set up our camper at an actual site and decided to do some 2-day-long backpack trips into some longer trails. The second one we went to was the Cascade Canyon. Absolutely beautiful. So get about 10 miles into the 22-mile loop and decide to set up our tent here since it was getting dark. We cook some food and chill for a bit before heading off to bed. Around 2 in the morning, we're all awakened by something just outside of the tent. My mind immediately jumps to bears or wolves or something. Then it starts talking. I will never forget it. I think there's 3 or 4 in the tent. Let's just get out of here. None of us could sleep the rest of the night. At the crack of dawn, we hightail it out of there. Made excellent time. Hiked the 12 miles in about 3 hours and got to the ranger station. Reported what happened. They said they had received a call similar to our story in the middle of the night. They sent rangers into the trail at dawn. Never found out what was going down. Didn't hear of anybody getting hurt. But then again, I didn't really look into it. One afternoon, I was completing this 14-kilometer, 5-hour hike on the edge of town. It's an unkept track on uneven ground, overgrown in many places that you relied on colored markers nailed into the trees because the track is covered in grass. It's not the easiest hike, and it's into some pretty unforgiving terrain. We're all wearing hiking shoes, long pants, and long-sleeve shirts to minimize the risks of snake bites, cuts, etc. We were the only people on the track that day that we saw. It's late afternoon, and we're about 2 kilometers from the remote trailhead. We're coming up onto the ridge and see somebody heading for us. We initially thought he was naked, but as he approached, we discovered he was wearing budgie smugglers, speedos, and thongs, flip-flops for the Americans. He approaches on the track, says good afternoon, and continues wandering along the track. He's got 2 hiking poles, no bag or clothing other than the budgie smugglers, and no torch that we could see. By the time we get back to the car, it was dark. We hung around a bit for packing up the car, but didn't see the man emerge back from the trailhead. There were no other cars parked at the trailhead either. The country he was hiking into wasn't very forgiving either, and there's no easy way you can loop back to civilization, except the trailhead. He came prepared with hiking poles, but why was he only wearing budgie smugglers and thongs? I had a bizarre experience while I was camping on the Key State Park beach. It's a small stretch of beach with a lagoon on one side and the Gulf of Mexico on the other. I was set up closer to the Gulf side, enjoying the stars, just relaxing in my tent at night. This was towards the end of a solo cross-country trip I was on. I had camped all over the country over the previous 35 days and had never really had anything too scary happen to me. But while I was lying there, almost simultaneously, the wind completely died and the ocean went completely silent. No waves crashing, no wind blowing, no sound whatsoever. I never truly understood the term deafening silence until that moment. For some reason, my body's response was complete and utter fear. I don't know why, but it was the most scared I had been along the entire trip. I was waiting for something horrible to happen. I had no idea what, but my mind was telling me something bad was about to happen. But less than a minute later, all the noise returned and I slowly relaxed again. When I was a kid, I went to a summer camp that would take older campers, 12 to 14, on excursions like a canoe trip and or hike for about a week at a time. It was located in Massachusetts, so we did a lot of hiking along the Appalachian Trail. One hike, there was a group of about 7 girls and 2 counselors, around 19 to 20 years old. I'll never forget. One morning, we were hiking along the trail and run into a random guy who is alone, sleeping stark naked in the middle of the morning trail. Now, you can't camp on the trail on the AT. Everyone who hikes it knows that. You've got to camp in the designated areas. This guy clearly didn't get the memo, so we carefully sidestep him and continue on our way. About 12 miles later, we get to our site for the night, and this dude is already there. Weird, considering we didn't see anybody pass through us throughout the day. The whole night, he's really friendly, telling us things like, "My father owns these woods." "Oh yeah? Yeah, he's your father too." Weird stuff. At one point, one of our counselors mentions that the site axe is missing. It was there when we arrived, and when she went to use it for firewood, it was gone. The guy had a knife collection that he was really keen on sharing with us, so it was pretty clear he was the only one who took the axe. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, he was gone. I went camping with my girlfriend at a very long provincial park a week before Canada Day, several years back. When we arrived, we were delighted to find out that we basically had the whole park to ourselves, as we're told by the ranger who had issued our pass. Furthermore, we were camping on an island that took about 1 hour to canoe out to, isolated with no other sites really nearby. A couple of days into our trip, we decided to take an extended canoe trip around the lake. Upon return, from a distance out, I noticed something on the shore of our campsite. As we got closer, we realized it was another canoe, which was very odd as there was nobody else occupying the other island sites, and the park was essentially empty. Finally, as we're about 30 meters away, we saw 3 people poking around our stuff, and they hadn't seen us yet, and were just sort of enjoying looking at our campsite. After a bit, they noticed us, rushed into their boat, and launched into the lake. We were only a couple feet apart as they came out and we went in. I was feeling super weird at the moment and just said, "Hey, what's up?" Not in the friendliest tone. I got a good look at them all. At that point, they were a bunch of teens straight out of the movie Deliverance. Slack-jawed, toothless, and generally unpleasant to gaze upon. They didn't say anything to us, but sort of just stared, very, very intensely. We got to our shore and checked our stuff to make sure they hadn't stolen anything, which they hadn't. But after the inspection, I looked back to the lake, and they were just sitting there, a way out, looking at us. Eventually, they leapt. My girlfriend and I had a really uncomfortable day thinking about it. We slept with the hatchet in the tent, and barely caught a wink as we were waiting for them to show back up. Thankfully, we didn't see them for the rest of our trip. half an alligator corpse, maybe 3 days dead, by a small creek behind a developing subdivision in southeast Pennsylvania. I was maybe 9, and there was an empty sandbank by the creek where my friends and I would particularly enjoy playing around. This day, I was alone. I pushed through the heavy foliage, as usual, only to find myself eye to eye with an alligator. A dead alligator. I froze in place. I was heavily into Nat Geo and Animal Planet at that age, and vaguely thought alligators to be somewhat lazy. They were always just lying around en masse in the documentaries. That doesn't mean I was good in emergency situations yet. I must have stared at it for at least half a minute before I realized it wasn't moving, and it also smelt pretty bad. This is when I looked away from its head and realized its back half had been violently torn away. There was no blood, few flies, and it had definitely not been there the day before. Just a half-dead lizard, unceremoniously deposited in my favorite creekside play spot. I didn't know how to process it at all, so I slowly backed out of the brush, the instinct-driven, idiot part of my brain screaming, "Are we sure it's dead?" and ran back to my nearby hidden bike. I rode straight home and played Super Mario 64 all day instead. I never told my parents or my young friends about it, what I'd found. None of us returned to the creek for at least a week, by which time I suppose it had disappeared. After that was left was a foul, aged odor of rot, which my friends attributed to creek scum. I knew better, though. In all these stories and nutcases in Pennsylvania, for years I convinced myself I had just hallucinated the gator, that it was just a log or something. It's impossible for me to begin to doubt my own senses. It's a massive relief to know that I saw what I saw for the reasons that make sense, that there are hordes and hordes of nutcases in Pennsylvania who own alligators. Back in the late 90s, a lady was said to have committed suicide on a portion of highway that borders a swamp-like area, crashing into an oncoming car. I don't know if her suicide has anything to do with my sighting, but the fact that the two coincide together just makes my skin crawl. In place of her death, or the part of her road that she shot off and died, is a memorial. You know, one of those typical sides of the road white crosses adorned in flowers and other memorial-based items. Well, because of my work, I have to drive this 2-lane highway every day, to and from. I've been very fortunate in these times of COVID-19 that my work has actually been steady. In fact, my workload has actually doubled, if not tripled, and so because of that, I've been very fortunate in these times of COVID-19 that my work has actually doubled, if not tripled, because of other people being laid off, and me being kept on. I want to keep what I do anonymous, so I'll leave it at that. But I'll just say that I help businesses create revenue and bring in more clients. Anyway, I was coming back in the evening time. Keep in mind that because it's spring and summer, it doesn't get dark out till super late. So at this point, the sun was just starting to go down, but it was still bright outside. I'm coming up the hill, getting ready to turn, and the lady's memorial is right there on the side of the road. Well, as I'm coming up, my headlights, which by the way I keep on 24/7, because I prefer to practice good driving, they reflected these two lights to the side of the road, directly to my right where the memorial is. Because the reflection of light caught my eye, out of reaction, I look over, and I see this lizard-looking thing on 2 legs that's looking right at me and my car. What exactly was I looking at? I'm not sure. Was I seeing a real-life alien? Was this somebody in a convincing costume that didn't get the memo that it was not yet Halloween? It had a look on its face like, oh crap, I've been spotted. And I went from doing 45 miles an hour to a slow 15, mouth agape and all. I didn't expect to see whatever this was. It looked to maybe be 4 to 5 feet tall, with a long tail that drug behind it. I thought it was a person in a costume again, but it looked to be just like a lizard man, a real-life lizard man. It was really ugly too. After staring at me for a couple of seconds as I'm passing, it turns around and jumps right back into the trees where it came from. The longer I spent looking at it, the more I came to the conclusion, more and more, that this was a real animal. If it was a costume, by any stretch of the means, then it was a Hollywood tier makeup and acting job. Why would anybody be out here on the side of the highway dressed up like that? I know people do crazy stuff, especially in this day and age with YouTube and everybody wanting views and fame, but it just seemed to be too far-fetched for me, and this thing looked far too animalistic to be a person. I didn't want to believe that, of course. I wanted to believe it was actually a person. I saw what I saw, and I cannot argue with myself and say that this did not look animalistic. Even the look in its eye had that wild animal look. So, afterwards, I called up my wife immediately and told her what I saw. Because, well, her and I tell each other everything, no matter how crazy. I told her that I was worried, and that I wasn't getting enough sleep, and that I was starting to have visions. What I saw didn't look like a vision, though. It looked like a real flesh and blood, living being. It looked intelligent, and it looked very much kind of like a human does. The stature, the way it carried itself when it walked, everything. It's kept me up at night, that's for sure. And the next few days and evenings, when I would drive past that memorial spot, I kept looking for this thing, to see if I could see what I saw. I never did see it again, and I have no idea what it was that I did see. I'm not even sure how to wrap my mind around it, because it is just so left field for me. It didn't look like a monster, but maybe a lizard that was exposed to radioactivity, that became part human or mutant or something. I know I'm venturing into the realm of comic book reality here, but the thought of it is just so out of the realm of normal. I can't even come up with words to accurately put a picture of what I saw. It was a human reptile that walked just like a man and acted like a man. I find the term lizard man to be the best way to accurately describe this thing. In my earlier 20s, I was an outdoor junkie. I traveled all over the northern United States and even many parts in Canada to see as much as I could. My whole ideology is that life is so short, I don't want to miss what this beautiful earth has to offer me. I had just gotten out of a very toxic relationship for 4 years with a girl that I probably should have never dated, and to put it lightly, the breakup devastated me. So, I wanted to turn my life around and give my time and energy towards being out in nature. That's what really sparked this whole incident. Had none of that ever happened, I wouldn't have had my sightings as I did, and I certainly wouldn't have been at the Algonquin Provincial Park that day. To make a long story short, I sold everything I had, pretty much lived for hitchhiking and walking everywhere I went. It sounds crazy, but emotional turmoil will make you do crazy things, and I wanted to remedy my pain with nature instead of substances and alcohol and things that would make me feel empty. Anyway, enough talk of broken hearts and trying to heal. Let's get on to what happened. I had a sighting of a reptilian-like creature at Algonquin Park in Ontario 5 years ago. I was hiking by myself, and I came to the end of one of this trail. To the right, the trail curves, but there's a sudden drop-off. If you were to fall, it's about a 50 to 60 foot drop. As I'm approaching this drop-off, and before I can even see down, I hear commotion, like something big moving around. At first, I get excited because I think maybe I'm about to see a large bear or something. But I look down, and I see this large reptilian thing running on all fours off into the woods. I had to double take because in my head, I'm thinking, what am I seeing? I wasn't high, I was not drunk, and I certainly was not on acid. I was sober as a honeybee. I was also the only one around because I did a lot of hikes by myself. I looked around to see if there's anybody else around me that I could motion to ask, did you see that too? Unfortunately, I was the only person around me. I stood there, looking out over the small drop-off into the canyon below, if you could even call it a canyon. About a few minutes later, an older man comes walking up the trail and smiles at me and greets me with a friendly hello. I turn to respond to him, but ask him if he's ever seen anything weird up here. He politely says no, and you could tell by the look on his face that he isn't quite sure what I was getting at. I pointed down at the drop-off and said I just saw this weird reptile creature running on all fours like an animal down there, and I wanted to know if you have ever seen such a thing. He shook his head and continued on with his hike. Now, I was struggling with reality. Did I really see that? Well, I let it go in the moment, and I continued on with my hike. Fast forward years later, and I'm telling my friend about it because we got on the topic of seeing strange animals, and he was telling me about his Bigfoot sighting that he had had. I don't believe in Bigfoot, or really anything that challenges the realm of reality that we live in, but I can't refute my experience, and so I was telling him about what happened to me. He told me that I should go check out this YouTube channel called What Lurks Beneath, and that I should submit my story to you. Well, I checked out your channel, and I was blown away to find that you had a series, an entire series at that, dedicated to just reptilian cryptid creatures. I learned so much in just spending a few hours listening to these encounters back to back. Crocodilian men, Komodo dragon-like people, very similar to what some of the creatures that I saw. I guess I'm not crazy after all, and I'm obviously not the only person seeing these types of creatures. Unlike a lot of the encounters you feature on your episodes, mine didn't happen anywhere close to a swamp, to my knowledge, but it did happen out in the open. Then, my story gets even weirder. Before I actually wrote up my story and sent it to you, I learned about these large mounds that apparently reptilians are drawn to, and I didn't even know if they lived underground or not, or if they lived in these mounds, but they seem to be in all these reptilian stories. Well, I reached out to a couple of my friends who have frequently hiked in the Algonquin Provincial Park. I don't know why I didn't think to do this initially when I had my sighting. I reached out to them and asked if they had ever found anything weird in their journey traversing to the park and hiking. This is where my jaw hit the floor. One friend of mine was telling me, which by the way he's a very experienced outdoorsman, but doesn't know anything about cryptids or certainly reptilians. He discovered what he found were really large mounds, about 9 feet tall, just roughly 6.5 miles off trail. I couldn't believe what he was telling me. This was after I listened to several of your reptilian episodes, and I immediately put the two together. I can't believe what I had heard. I had to sit down and process everything all these years later to realize that this was reality, and I actually saw a reptilian being. I never would have thought in a million years they existed, let alone resided in the Algonquin Provincial Park. I wanted to tell you that I used to work as a veterinarian's assistant for a few years in a small veterinarian clinic in a far more rural area. I'm not normally from this area, but because I have family close by, I went through some really rough personal times that required me to move in with said family. I ended up working at this place for a number of years. This clinic saw a lot of animals, farm animals, and exotic animals alike. Maybe exotic isn't the right word for it, but more than your typical cat and dog. You see a lot more bigger animals out here than you do in the cities, and we had people bringing in horses and all other sorts of animals. But this is not why I'm writing to you. I wanted to get some background information cleared out of the way before I wrote to you what is really going on. See, I listened to a lot of these Dogman encounters that you've posted, and I've heard multiple occasions where cats and dogs alike have gone missing. Same with livestock. But people are not talking about it. It's what it's like to work in my field where you have people working with animals, and they bring these animals into you who have been attacked by said creatures. I've seen some pretty gruesome sightings. Horses, for example, that have been attacked by what I determined to be a very large canine. This one horse, for example, nearly had its jugular vein ripped open, and its back leg was severely ripped open. I'm telling you this now because there's no known predator in the area that attacks the way this did. Because my veterinarian clinic that I worked at is really the only one for miles around. If I give up the location, you could figure it out, and I kind of want to keep it private for the sake of my older employees. I have a lot of respect for them and the hard work they do. I apologize for that, but it's ultimately to protect them. I've seen cats and dogs come in that were nearly mauled to death. In fact, I can remember this one German Shepherd that was brought in recently. She was such a sweetheart, but she was blinded and had her front paws ripped off. Of course, on the job, I couldn't outright say this was a Dogman, because there are cougars and black bears, but if you take time to study how these particular predators attack their prey, it's nothing like the way a Dogman does. Unfortunately, there is not an in-depth study of how Dogmen attack, other than listening to episode after episode of what these things will and can do to animals. Something without a doubt is going on, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of it. Don't think I know this all by myself. I have friends in other veterinarian clinics across the East Coast that we talk, and we talk. Clinics that are in far more rural areas like this one that I work at, who are prone to situations like this happening. It doesn't stop. This is a real situation that we need to take seriously. If anything, even if you don't believe in the existence of cryptids or Dogman, there is some sort of large canid predator out there doing severe damage to these animals. It's showing itself time and time again. Of course, there's always going to be the occasional bear attack, and bears can do a significant amount of damage to an animal. Upon further inspection of the wounds, bite marks, and method of attack, these are without a doubt canid. The only thing that points me is to that whatever reason all these animals are being attacked by a large group of wolves possibly. That doesn't make any sense unless you add in Dogmen into the mix, with their population ever growing. There has been a couple of clientele of mine that I've gotten the chance to speak to about their experiences with Dogmen, but in my profession, talking about such things would be nonsense to so many. I have to be very careful who I speak to and what I ask them and tell them. There's an older gentleman in his 60s that has some farm animals that he's brought in. They're pretty banged up, and he's a man who has openly told me he's seen some things that I wouldn't probably believe him if he told me. On a personal level, I got him to open up with me, and he's seen these creatures try to take down some of his horses and animals. He doesn't know what to call them, and I haven't brought up the term Dogman to him, so he just calls them large wolves. He described them as unforgiving, vicious, and without mercy. They've already claimed the lives of several other of his animals, and he's in the works of moving these horses that I was working with. I'm pretty sure that you want some of the gruesome details, but out of respect for him and myself for having to relive it, I'm not going to go into vivid detail of all the damage that was done. Let's just say that they needed facial reconstruction, and their limbs needed to be sewn back together properly. As of now, though, both of his horses are doing great and are making full recoveries in a different area entirely. That's just one client, though. Another client not even 20 miles away from the one with the horses had issues with the same supposed creature taking her small dogs. Anyway, had I not known about cryptids and Dogmen in general, I would probably have zero clues as to what was going on. At this point, it has to be a Dogman. There are no other options. I'm convinced. This happened when I was 14, and I was spending the night at a friend's house. Well, long story short, a bunch of family drama erupted at his house, and their family drama got pretty physically violent. I felt very uncomfortable staying the night, so I just decided that I was going to go walk home, which was only about 4 miles away. Even though it was at 11 p.m., I was 14, and I had no real problems walking home by myself. Besides, I did this all the time. This is where my story turns from domestic abusive depressive to horror story turn reality. On my way home, I began to notice I was being followed. At first I thought it was a person, but then I realized it was something else. I would turn, and I would see it dart behind the trees and cars. At one point, it had a really hard time disguising itself in the shadows because I don't know if it knew any better or what, but this thing looked like a flipping werewolf. I could see a long muzzle and tall pointed ears and the way it was hunched over. It was like this entire time, the entire walk home, this just was keen on following me. But it never got any closer. It stayed a very specific distance behind me and just kept trailing me, hiding every chance it got, watching me. I kept looking over my shoulder constantly, trying to stay aware of all my surroundings. When I got about a mile from my house, I had to cross this back road that goes over this tiny creek and connects to another road. Before I continue my story, if I would have stayed in the neighborhood I was at, it would have taken me an extra 2 whole miles plus to get home, because I would have had to go down a long, busy street, and I just wanted to get home. I was pretty freaked out at this point, but I figured I was walking already at a good pace, and I didn't feel like I was in total doom. At least not yet. This back road, which is more of just a back road curve, doesn't have any houses on it, and there's a little concrete bridge over this creek, and there's virtually no lights. Look, I understand that 14-year-old me was crazy enough to make this decision when I spotted a werewolf-looking creature following me all the way home, but I felt confident that I would make it, and that if anything, I could always run, since I was a pretty good runner. As I'm walking up to this back road curve area, I could see the bridge in sight. I only had a little further to walk, and the noise behind me had stopped. I kept checking behind me real quick, and I didn't see anything following me anymore. And in that moment, I felt a quick snippet of relief. Maybe I had just been dreaming it. Maybe it was a hallucination. However, that relief was quickly washed away when I heard movement in the woods off to the left of me and the right of me. It sounded like there were multiple people coming toward me in my direction, so I decided to double time it, and it scared me because I thought I was going to get mugged. I reached the bridge, and I began to cross over it. I'm still hearing more and more noise following me from the woodline on both sides. Then, as the noise continues, I begin to hear a noise in front of me in the woods to my right. Now, my heart is racing even more than it ever has all night. I was thinking I was going to be ambushed, knifed, and left for dead by a mob of homeless people, or thieves, or God knows what. But the noise never left the woods. It just stayed there, beyond the trees. I began sprinting once I got across this small bridge until I got to another section of the neighborhood that would safely lead me back to where my house was. Looking back, I was expecting to be chased by an angry mob, but I never saw anything or anybody. I wish I could explain what happened to me that night, but I really don't know. I believe I saw something, some sort of monster. I don't believe it was somebody in a costume. It looked far too real. Sometimes I think back to that and wonder if I was just having a strong vision, or again, maybe I was dreaming. I don't know what this is. It was straight up in the realm of horror fiction. That's just how weird I feel my story is. My parents are early birds, so by the time I got home, everybody was already in bed, asleep. That entire night, I felt paranoid, constantly looking out my window. I didn't know if I was being followed, or possibly if these things or people were going to follow me back to my house, or what. I didn't know what to expect. I called my friend as soon as I got back to check up on him, and things I guess had calmed down at his house, even though he wanted to run away because of how bad his home situation was. I didn't have the guts to bring up what happened to me and kind of put his situation down, even though I felt like I was followed. Even just typing this out sounds so silly, but I saw what I did with my own 2 eyes, and I don't take it back. About 4 years later, that same friend hung himself in his closet, right before graduation. I guess his home situation had gotten so bad that nobody realized. Anyway, this story isn't just necessarily about my encounter with the unknown, but in a way, it reminds me of him, paying homage to a good old lost friend. So, this isn't a story that happened to me, but it is a story that I've heard about by a very good friend of mine who goes fishing all over the world. He has had his own strange encounters, being an out-at-sea experienced fisherman, and having his hand at all sorts of bizarre creatures that we would never imagine dream of seeing. He fishes primarily off the coast of Australia, and has been in the southwestern region as of lately. He recalls seeing a very large shape just below the surface of the water, but low enough to where you can't really discern what exactly it is you're looking at. To give me a size, he was saying anywhere between 9 to 12 meters in length. Absolutely massive. Most great whites, to give you a perspective, range anywhere between 3 to 5 meters. The shape he described to me did not resemble that of a whale at all, but a very bizarre shaped looking fish. He couldn't explain further, but it awed him and several other experienced fishermen he was with on his boat. The creature never fully surfaced, but came up enough to see the shape and size of this behemoth. Then, he told me about a horrifying story that happened about 15 years ago with a bunch of researchers just off the coast of Australia. This occurred in the same southwestern region that he was fishing in. When he told me this, it literally gave me chills. Deep sea stuff and sea monsters kind of freak me out anyway, so this was just the icing on the cake for me. Again, about 15 years ago, there was a fellow whose name I don't remember is in charge of a sea expedition research team, and I believe he was in charge of tagging fish, specifically great white sharks. Well, apparently, this fellow tagged a 3-meter great white shark off the coast of Australia, in the same location at my friend and where he fishes at, and where he saw this really large shape underneath the water. The story goes on that on 4 a.m. on Christmas Eve, the shark was pulled down to about 580 meters of depth below the surface, which comes to around a depth of around 1,900 feet under the water, at an incredible speed. The temperature also rose from 46 degrees Fahrenheit to about 78 degrees Fahrenheit, which means that the shark and the tag went from swimming in the waters to ending up in the belly of another fish. That's the only way you're going to get that much of a drastic temperature change of 78 degrees. But here's where the question really remains. What eats a 9-foot-long great white shark? Great white sharks normally can plummet to around 6,000 feet in depth, so it's possible it could have been a much larger shark. Speculation surrounding this phenomenon has pinpointed orcas, also known as killer whales, as the culprit. But the problem there resides in that a killer whale doesn't generally dive more than 250 or given 800 feet. They will, however, dive at depths more than 3,500 feet if there is food, but the results here show that the shark was possibly attacked and then dragged down very deep to around 1,900 feet. This means that this was probably done by a much larger shark, if it was a shark. And again, the question here is how long of a shark do you need to eat a 9-foot-long great white shark? The story continues that this tag apparently resided in the belly of whatever fish ate this great white shark for the next 8 days, between 300 feet and surface level. And between that time, before finally floating up to the surface and being found on shore, only 2.5 miles away from where the shark was originally tagged out in the ocean. I don't know how much truth there is to the story, but it certainly is startling to say the least, and of course, quite terrifying. I mean, I never had actually any plans to go out in the ocean myself to go swimming or fishing, but once I heard that story, that about sealed the deal for me. The story that he told me, I think has happened around 2005 if I'm not mistaken, and the large fish that he has been seeing on and off in the past couple of years has been in the same area. Again, I want to say that he is seeing an inconceivably large shape, around 12 meters in size below the surface, enough to barely make out that there is something there, but nothing definitive as far as knowing what it is exactly. It's some sort of enormous fish, the best answer I can get out of him. It doesn't appear by shape to resemble a whale or an orca or a shark, so we are all left wondering what exactly it could be. He has seen this shape several times, and it appears to be slow moving, or so it seems, and then after a short while, it disappears back in the depths of the ocean. It has never fully surfaced that he has been able to see. I haven't done any sports fishing in a while, but I used to go at night off the coast of South Carolina for a few years rather loosely. I don't know if this is a creature of the deep or some sort of alien or what. It's nighttime, so it's pretty dark and visibility is poor, and off in the distance in the water, I began to see this glowing. I began muttering to myself, what the hell is that? Well, this glow is just a stationary object, or so it seems. I get a couple of my fishing partners to look over and try and see what it is that I'm looking at. It's sitting there, pulsating underneath the water, a dull green bluish glow. It's perfectly still, and we're sitting there debating what it is and if it's a fish or another fishing vessel. It was maybe 40 yards out in the water, and maybe no more than 20 feet below the surface if I had to give you my best guess. It was bright though. We could clearly see it. Then, in the middle of us discussing what it could have been, all of a sudden, it shoots off to the east and disappears. It never stopped pulsating, and it stayed that way for the entire time, even when it shot off. My partners and I were freaked the hell out. Part of me thinks it was an alien organism or something under the water, but I don't know anything. I just can't think of any living organism in the ocean that would not only pulsate light like that, but that would then shoot off 50 miles an hour, if not faster, underneath the water, then just completely vanish. To me, it was the stuff of nightmares, something that you can't fully explain. That evening alone, we were roughly 65 miles offshore, give or take. I can't think of a single explanation for what we saw. Neither can my partners. This happened near the end of my sports fishing ventures, and I would be lying if I said it didn't have at least a small part to play in me quitting that recreational sport. I mean, after all, you do feel and see all sorts of weird stuff being out there at night on the ocean. Weird sounds, weird sensations, things that weren't just quite for me in the end. This happened to me during my tenure in the U.S. Navy. I served from 1981 to about 1996 and had gone on several expeditions, much of which I will not talk about because it's classified, and I really don't want to risk my identity in revealing too much information. But there are certain things that I will talk about, some things in the water that I've seen that most people have not. Out of all the bizarre sights and sounds you get to experience out at sea, there was this one experience that I wanted to talk about. During the early morning hours, and this only happened for about 3 days in a row, we were in the South Pacific, and these organisms, these things were astonishingly long and skinny. All of us saw them too. There were tons of them. They were these 70 to 80 feet long sea serpents, or what I assume to be sea serpents, possibly eels. They were ghost white from head to tail, and what was strange is even though their length was something else, their girth wasn't at all what you'd think it was. It was like looking at an 80-foot white anaconda in the water. The thickest part of their entire body was maybe 12 inches in girth. Other than that, it was like looking at a long string or rope. They were just these long, slender sea creatures whipping around in the water. There were hundreds of them all around the boat. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. They only stayed for a couple of hours before disappearing underneath the ship into the deep. But they would come up again out of those every 3 days we were there, like clockwork in the early morning hours, and disappear again once the sun came up enough. The first time they showed up, it was right as the sun was coming up. To this day, I've never heard of them, nor have ever heard them talked about. They are just some things you get the pleasure of seeing out in the water that will simply blow your mind. When I think back about it, I'm not really scared at some of the sights I saw, more intrigued because of how little mankind generally knows about the ocean and what dwells in it. Many people, like scientists, would like to think we know it all, but send them out on a ship, like many of us in the Navy, and you'll see some things that are worth talking about. One of my friends who passed away many years ago used to be a very experienced tuna fisherman for years and years. Hundreds of miles out in the ocean, he claims he saw what appeared to be a living dinosaur, an amphibious-looking crocodilian creature that he said measured between 40 to 50 feet in length, and this thing swam underneath their boat several times. He believes it was drawn in because of the influx of heavy tuna they were getting for food, but said this thing was right out of the movie Lake Placid, if you've ever seen that movie. The other fishermen there got several good looks at it, and said it did look to be very dinosaur-looking, kind of in a sturgeon way. It had more of an amphibious look to it. Many of the other fishermen on board were scared by it, and how could you not be scared of something that size? Intimidating doesn't begin to describe the terror that would instill itself in you. His strong words of advice and wisdom was that whenever there's a large amount of huge food, whether it be a huge grouping of fish or a huge grouping of large fish, you're going to get some large predators that flock to the area to feast. It's the food chain 101. He experienced this time and time again, being out tuna fishing, and even had his fair share with extremely large sharks in similar scenarios. My father was a fisherman for many, many years when I was much younger. I used to actually go out with him on the boat at nighttime. I never thought about it, but I heard some of the scariest sounds you could ever imagine hearing while you're out in the middle of the ocean at nighttime. Horrible roaring and screaming, like some monster out of a movie was looking to feed on its next meal. You would hear all sorts of stuff like that. A lot of times, it didn't even sound like it was underneath the water either. Like the roaring I'm talking about sounded as if it was closer to the boat, and it would keep me up awake at night. This is just one of many examples of creepy things that I've heard while out at the sea at nighttime. My dad has just become so immune to it and kind of just blocks it out. For me though, it's just not that easy. I haven't gone out to sea with him in forever, and every time I do, it feels like a horrible nightmarish experience at nighttime. Don't get me wrong though, not all of the sea at nighttime is a terrifying trip to a land unknown. You get a gorgeous view of the stars in the sky, unlike ever before. But it is just so black that you cannot see the hand in front of your face sometimes, unless there's enough light out from the sky. Then there are those nights that you start hearing weird noises. There's the obvious creaks of the boat and the water splashing around. I almost wonder if there's any sort of sensory deprivation that goes on while you're out at sea at night, because it feels like things can get so quiet. I would imagine the ocean becomes much more alive because the night is when many of the larger predators come out to feed. I would certainly hate to fall into the water when it's dark outside. My dad always makes sure that if I'm going out, to never, ever go near the edge of the boat. I'm not really sure if this story falls into the context of a lake or sea monster, but it is mysterious. About 20 years ago, my father was on a fishing boat off the western coast of Australia, where one of the fishermen fell off the side of the boat into the water and never resurfaced. That alone is a mystery, because there were no bubbles in the water, nothing. It was simply like he just sank to the bottom without any hint or inkling to where he went. He wasn't wearing anything heavy, so it's not like he sunk. Confused and deeply concerned as to why their friend hadn't resurfaced, a couple of them got on diving suits and equipment and jumped down into the water to see if they can find any trace of them. This is what's weird. There was literally no trace of him at all. Not his clothes, and they couldn't see where he would have fallen down. The depth below the ship was well over 100 meters deep, and their only thought was that he resurfaced far away from the boat. But the waters were calm, and you could clearly see anything had he resurfaced anywhere in eyesight. However, over the next couple of hours, enormous great white sharks and tiger sharks began migrating around the boat and the waters around. It's almost like they were pulled in because they sensed either blood in the water or food. There were quite a few of them, and they finally left at the end of the day. No trace of this fisherman was ever found, nor was there ever any scene to have any blood or anything that would give way to where or what happened to this poor fisherman. He was soon written off as dead and had drowned. Still one of the great mysteries that is talked about, because to this day, nobody knows what happened to his body or why he never reappeared out of the water. It's like something grabbed him and pulled him off into the deep. That's just where my mind goes with it. But then you think about it, and it still doesn't explain that all the sharks coming into the area, like they smelt blood or possibly food, and they hung around for quite a few hours until the evening when they left. This is possibly the only time I've ever heard where somebody goes off board into the water and just completely vanishes without a trace. No body, no clothes, no signs of where their body even went. It was very disturbing for even me, and it has weighed heavily on my father's heart for a long time. He has felt partially responsible for what happened. He even tells me now that when he recalls the story, the heaviest feeling was leaving without him and realizing they were never going to find him, and that he was gone for good. Who knows what happened to his body, or in this case, who knows what ate it? I'll never forget this story because it's simply just a reminder to stay out of the depths of the ocean. I truly believe the Kraken or something large down there exists, and it's why mankind is supposed to stay far, far away. Now, for the story. My mother is a marine biologist, and around 10 years ago, had the opportunity to take a deep sea dive out in one of those tiny scientific vessels. I don't know what they're called, but they're tiny submarines that hold less than 10 people, and they're meant for diving in great depths. She tells me that they were around 510 meters deep when they hit a small shelf of ocean floor. Down this far, it's pitch black, because light from the surface can only reach so far. This is where they made a terrifying discovery. Not far from their ship was a massive 14-foot great white shark, or at least had been when it was alive. This thing was dead and had fallen to the bottom, which is common for most large predators and fish. But the circumstances surrounding its death were very interesting, as well as terrifying. By the looks of it, it was freshly killed, and the most horrifying part of it all was that it was only the top part of the great white shark, meaning from the nose all the way to the end of its front gills, and its side fins, and everything else from its tail was gone. It had clearly been bitten in half in one bite. If you're still not understanding what I'm getting at, something big that's down here came up from behind this great white shark and bit it in half with one bite, almost devouring the entire shark in one massive gulp, leaving the front gills to the front of the face intact. In fact, this kill was so fresh, there were still little bits of blood clouding around where it was laying, and there were no sea creatures feasting on it yet. Usually, when a larger sea animal dies like this, a whale for example, they sink down to the bottom of the sea floor when they're eaten on pretty quickly. So for them to come across a fresh kill like this was amazing in and of itself, but to see something that bit a 14-foot long great white shark in half is amazing too. My mother is weird though, because when she told me the story, I'm terrified and I'm not even the one in the water, but she and her entire team found this fascinating that there could be such a large alpha predator in the sea out there that is yet to be discovered, potentially a much larger shark. This scientific expedition was taken far off the coast of California. How far exactly, I can't tell you. Probably around 100 miles, but that's just a guess. This was nearly 8 years ago now. Was at about 40 miles out on the Gulf Coast of Mexico when my sonar equipment began malfunctioning. It wasn't malfunctioning because it was faulty equipment. It was malfunctioning because there was an interference. Something far underneath the boat was causing some sort of electronic interference with my sonar machinery. I don't know if there are submarines down here. I guess that's always been a possibility. But the max depth where I was at was only around 180 feet, give or take. So I'm not too sure. I couldn't quite figure out why my machinery was malfunctioning. But then in the water, I began to feel this pulsating that was coming from far beneath the boat. It was a very strange sensation, like something was sending off energy waves through the water, kind of like static electricity that you could feel the vibration of the pulsation. There was no rhythm, there was no timing. It was just sporadic and pulsating and lasted for a few minutes, and then suddenly stopped. After that, my sonar machinery would not turn on at all, and I gave up on getting it to work. When I got back to shore though, everything seemed to just work fine and was fully operable. I really have no idea what was going on out there, or what that was all about. I've rendezvoused in this area in the Gulf of Mexico multiple times for all sorts of trips, and I've never had this sort of thing happen before. Me and my other fishing buddies will swap and share stories, and after telling them this story about what happened, they're trying to scare me and say that it was a UFO underneath the water. I don't believe that, but I definitely believe there was some sort of possible machinery underneath the water. Possibly a military watercraft of some sort. My buddies, who have also fished multiple times in the Gulf themselves, have told me about seeing strange lights in the sky and weird objects coming out of the water. Not animals or fish, but actual objects emerging to the surface and then resubmerging. Things that typically don't resemble typical underwater craft at all. The one that one of my friends saw was a large black sphere that had glowing lights all over it, is how he described it, and it was during the evening. None of us are firm believers in aliens, to my knowledge, or anything like that, but I wouldn't be surprised if the military was testing things out in this area of the ocean. I've heard other stories over the course of my time being a fisherman, but it's all hearsay until I actually physically see the evidence. Maybe I do have some evidence to believe that they are doing this stuff. I was 13 at the time, and we lived in Ohio. My dad was outside, fixing up his old tool shed, when we both started to hear a low growl come just from beyond the trees. I was in my bedroom at the time, playing video games, and I had my window open. I could hear my dad outside working, since he was right there in plain view. It was a beautiful sunny morning, so I enjoyed the cool breeze coming in. But the issue with my window being open is that it was always a pain trying to get it to close. It would somehow get stuck. Anyway, I heard the low rumble growl too, and I looked out the window and saw something that scared me more than anything else I'd ever seen. A wolf, about 7 to 8 feet tall, with a thick body, covered in grayish-white fur, standing on 2 legs like it was a human. This creature was huge and was walking upright, just like a person does. I saw it had 5 big claws on its front paws, and some on each of its hind legs. It looked like this thing had human hands with claws on them. The thing was creeping closer and closer to my father from beyond the tree's visibility point behind the shed. It just stood there, looking around and sniffing as if it were following the scent trail to where my father was. I was frozen in absolute horror, and I watched as it began closely watching my dad, observing him like a prey just before pouncing. I screamed out the window because it was open and that there was a monster in the trees. My dad looks and sees what I'm screaming at, and sees this thing. Then he bolts into the house. He races, locking the door. Then he runs into my room and tries the best he can to close my window, but can't get it to budge. As he's trying to get it shut the best he can, but the thing always gets stuck. This werewolf-looking animal is now walking and approaching the house right where we're at. My dad and I, in fear, fall backward and huddle in the corner together, unsure of what this approaching creature will do, our eyes fixed on it as it slowly begins approaching. It opens its mouth and snarls, very loud. It was very disturbing. It appeared to be very upset that we were in the room, or so I sensed. It then bares its teeth at us, and makes a very sinister looking grin on its face, like it wanted to hurt us. My dad didn't own any weapons during this time, so he pulled me into the back room that was my bedroom and into the bathroom and locked the door. The werewolf, or whatever this thing was, growled and snarled around the house a bit more. Then it stopped. My dad slowly opens the door and checks to see if the creature was gone, but he couldn't see it anywhere. He kept looking and looking, and there was no trace of it. It took a little while before he felt brave enough to step outside to truly check if this thing really was gone. He went from room to room, opening all the windows to see and peer outside. It was probably hours before he felt comfortable going out to his shed again. It boggled my mind. You think after an experience like that, you wouldn't be stepping foot outside again, but not my dad. He just brushed it off. This happened about 11 in the morning, on a bright sunny day. Whatever creature this was had no problem showing itself to us, and scarred my father and I for life. I've never, ever seen a beast so large as the creature that we saw that day. He said he was going to tell his friend, a very experienced hunter, about it. Well, he called him, but to no avail. A week passed, and my dad's friend still had not returned my father's phone call. Maybe the thought of a wolf standing up on two legs was too much for him. It couldn't have been a werewolf, because I don't believe that werewolves exist, but this defied every act of logic. I've heard stories of werewolves, and maybe even vampires, but I'd never seen one myself. Maybe this really was a werewolf. If that's the case, what's stopping vampires and other creatures of the night from existing? That's what I'd like to know. Oh, and to give some more context, my dad was a single dad at the time. It was just me and him living in this tiny 2-bedroom house. My mother and him had split when I was really little, and so I'd frequently go back and forth between spending time at both their houses. I don't really have many happy memories of my childhood, but those times when I stayed with my father, they were good. Well, besides this time, of course. I saw a massive upright, walking black wolf on 2 legs, walking across the road the other night. It was huge and had a long tail dragging behind it. I thought at first that it must be some kind of mythical creature. It was about 8 feet tall, I'm guessing, and had long fur, kind of like a bear, but much darker. Very shaggy and unkempt looking. It startled me the second I saw it, and I had to slam on my brakes in hopes of not hitting this thing. It darted across the road quickly and paid no attention to my oncoming vehicle. I could only stare at it as it ran up to a tree and jumped up topwards to the top of the tree. Once it jumped up into the tree, it was gone. I don't think my jaw has ever fell open that big before. When I say to you just how big this creature was, I mean this creature was so large. Taller than I am, and I'm 6'4". This thing had a broad chest, like it had been lifting weights, and a large head that looked disproportionate to its body, but it looked just like a wolf's head. Its legs were like those of a world champion weightlifter giant, rippling muscles coursing underneath its skin. This thing was a true behemoth of a creature. I just couldn't stop staring up at it in the tree in complete and utter awe. It took me about an extra 10 minutes to drive myself home that night, because I just couldn't fathom what I had seen that darted across the road in front of me. This occurred on August 7th, 2020, just outside of Colorado Springs, Colorado. It was already dark, and it ran about 20 to 30 feet in front of my car. Trust me when I say I got more of a look at it than I really bargained for. This was the night that I saw a real-life living monster. The next morning, when I told some of my friends what I had seen, they just kind of looked at me as if I was insane. I mean, I get it. I guess I'm a little nuts after all, but I know I'm not crazy. Not enough to make this up. I wasn't sleep deprived. I was completely sober. I know what I saw, and I will continue to share my experiences with people who are willing to listen. I know this all sounds pretty whacked out, but I'm serious when I say I saw what I saw. It was no dream. I'm just glad I could find a safe haven to submit my encounter like this, and to be believed and not be laughed at or mocked, as most people would. I'll forever drive more cautiously at night now because of this. I hope my experience can help somebody else in the future to be brave enough to share theirs. I know enough about cryptozoology to know that what I saw was a skinny, wolf-looking creature that walked on two legs about a month ago in a large open field coming towards the highway. I happened to look over the moment that I was driving by, and I saw movement that caught my eye, and I saw this creature barreling towards the road in front of me. I gasped because I'm in shock at what I'm seeing, and then it quickly ducked down into the tall grass, and I never saw it again after that. I'm a very novice crypto researcher, and only have a very elementary grasp on what a Dogman truly is. I never thought I would actually see it in person, let alone get as close to it as I got. I drove right past where it ducked down into the tall grass. I'm not sure if it was trying to hide or what it was doing. In any case, I didn't stop to see if it was still there, and didn't want to drive all the way back around. I kept driving, because to be honest with you, it freaked me out. Sure, I find cryptids fascinating, but that doesn't mean I want to be up close and personal to one. I almost wonder if it didn't know my car was coming and was already out running towards the road. My car came around a heavily wooded bend in the area, around this field, and then it tried to fully conceal itself the best it could in the grass. It was gone, just like that, like it never even existed. I had to blink and think about what I just saw. It's like my brain couldn't wrap around the fact that this was real, that my encounter with it was not just a really bad nightmare that I wish would end. It looked just like a wolfman. No, not from the movies, but a wolf-looking human creature. I don't know too much about what a Dogman truly is, and what I saw was what I believed to be one in the flesh. I'm not sure why it came out into the open like that, but I do know that they are much faster than what I witnessed when it ducked down. I'm glad I got to see it up close. It's just too bad I don't have any knowledge on what it truly is, or what it was doing out there. I would think somebody who's more versed in Dogman would know something, and maybe they've had several encounters with these same creatures I have. Anyway, this is where my story ends. Once I drove to the other end of the field, I didn't see it anymore, since it had ducked down entirely and was now hidden away from view. This was in the evening time. There was still plenty of light outside, but the sun was starting to set. I didn't see it again for the rest of the evening or night, but I kept my eyes open on the large grassy field and the trees around it, kind of hoping that it would eventually pop up again. No such luck. The night went on, and no more Dogmen popped out on the road or next to it. My family comes from the southwestern area of the United States. We're not full-blooded Latino, but a lot of us are. The town in which my parents come from in New Mexico is prone to all sorts of weird sightings of shapes moving underneath the sand, lights in the skies, people being abducted, horned, upright walking beasts attacking people, people going missing, all sorts of crazy stuff that you would not believe normally. This is an area also full of Native American legends and lore. Even many of the native people in the area talk about the dangers of living out there, and not just from the increasingly rising temperatures in the desert or the venom of a rattlesnake, but the beings that are said to lurk underneath the sand. Anyway, it all dates back to the 1940s when my grandparents, before giving birth to my father, purchased land in the area and built a large house to live in, a little way outside of any real civilization. They owned and operated a bunch of cattle farming for years and years. They overdid it in the first few years and them running it, and were going through ranch helpers like crazy, I guess. People would come on board to help, but get spooked at all the stuff going on out there. kids as young as 14 and 15 getting hired on to help. Some of them would flat out go missing, while others would report seeing strange tall beings approaching them through the pastures. Others talked about massive black beasts that would come out of the sand and come for them. Just crazy stuff, am I right? I could never get my grandfather to tell me too much about this stuff, because he was just a stubborn old man. May his soul rest in peace. My father was the one that opened up about it and told me everything I needed to know. He told me growing up that it was just a part of business as usual. Sometimes, if not most of the time, he felt rattlesnakes were the least of his worries, with all the bizarre sightings and happenings that were going on down there. Growing up in those conditions, it makes you a pretty tough individual. I'm not gonna lie. He's a strong man, enlisted in the army later on, and even served in Vietnam. Now, he runs a mechanic shop full-time and works on old cars. He's a very straight-to-the-point kind of person, and absolutely cannot stand it when you beat around the bush with something. He's the last person I'd ever expect to come up with a wild story filled with lies and fairy tales. So, when he began telling me about the things that were going on the land that his father and mother purchased and built on, was hair-raising, to say the least. He claims it was every day that they saw something go on. The things I mentioned to you at the beginning, the horned beasts, the creatures coming out of the sand, all of that. They would see this stuff go on non-stop. My father just grew so immune to the whole thing that he learned to live with it. They weren't losing cattle, and they weren't being hurt in any way, at least to an extent, and at least the family. As he told me, they were having ranch hands disappear left and right, while others would leave fleeing. That was when my father was just a little boy. They eventually had to hire out of town and even state to get some full-timers who were brave enough and paid enough to endure. There were a few ranch hands that reported being called out far into the desert night, like they were under some sort of spell or trance, and then wake up. Others reported being heavily watched during the day and night, so much so that they did not feel safe doing their job, like they had a sense of doom that continuously loomed over them. Much of all the crazy things that happened was what he believed was due to the natives and the magic they practiced on the land, long before they ever built the house and purchased the land. The land and all around the area was said to be cursed. They had apparently told his father that when he bought it, which by the way he got that huge segment of land for extremely cheap, even back in the 40s it was dirt cheap. My grandfather didn't have a lot of money, and he couldn't refuse the offer. With his leftover money, he decided to then build the house and the ranch that would accompany it. He would tell me all sorts of stuff that he saw growing up, and horrible things that went on. They did eventually lose some cattle over the course of the years, but not a lot. The cattle they did lose either vanished entirely, just like some of the ranch hands did, or were found with parts of their organs missing, or torn into pieces, looking like they fell into a wood chipper. At night, you would hear all sorts of howling, shuffling noises. Sometimes my dad would tell me about hearing a giant herd of bulls were full-on stampeding towards the house, only to look outside and not see a thing. He would see horned figures off in the distance, watching him at night, just before it got completely dark out. He witnessed large beasts of the earth, as he called them, climbing out of the sand as if below the sand lied a giant pit, finding dead rattlesnakes all over that appeared to die for no apparent reason. Many strange occurrences just like these constantly. That's not even counting all the strange things you would hear, smell, or see off in the distance. He's so casual when he talks about it now because he just grew up around it. He's told me these stories for years, and over time, he's eventually given me more and more details, especially with the natives' curse and whatnot. How the land was cursed before it was bought, and his take on all of it was there's a strong sense of dark native magic that looms over the entire area, not just the property. That is what he believes is solely responsible for everything. Even his dad grew pretty numb to all the sightings and weird happenings. Pretty emotionless, to say the least. For the first 5 to 10 years, his management of livestock and the ranch were extremely poor, so when things like dead animals would happen or missing ranch hands, he wouldn't say anything to anybody. At first, many of the ranch hands he tried to bring on were vagabonds or people who didn't have much of anything. They weren't known throughout the community and were cheap hands to bring on board. Nobody really ever realized they were missing, and back in the 1940s, this kind of thing happened far more than you realize it did. Years back, I did get a chance to go back and visit grandfather's old land and house when it was currently vacant at the time. My father took me and warned me ahead of time that we're probably going to see, smell, or hear weird things, and that it's important to stay grounded. Having not grown up in it, the things I would experience might disturb me, and I needed to be ready for it, psychologically. He didn't want me walking away from this experience traumatized at all. I told him I could handle anything, so we went. I hadn't been to my grandfather's house and ranch since I was little, so my memories were pretty vague. But, pulling up on the place, it was just like how I did remember it, even if it was only a little. It hadn't been updated much since the time it was built, other than the bare necessities. My grandfather was kind of a cheapskate. We arrived in the evening time, and the entire place just had this feeling that I can't quite capture into words. It was startling, like anything could happen at any given moment. You felt on edge, ready for something bad to happen, like you didn't want to sit still for very long. I didn't see anything crazy, but I would occasionally get a big waft of rotting flesh or raw sewage, or both. My dad would smell it too, and told me we shouldn't take too much time here. The fact we're here is known, and we need to not take long. Keep in mind this place had been vacant for years and years. Nobody had been around. There was absolutely no reason why we should have smelt either of those things. I asked him about the source of the rotting flesh and sewage that seemed to come and go, but like I said, there were no, understandably, reliable sources of either of them. We didn't hang out there too long before the feeling of being uncomfortable grew and grew, too much, till we decided it was best to leave this place far behind. Visiting that whole area just had a feeling to it, an unmistakable feeling, like you're not supposed to be there, like you do not belong. Many natives don't even inhabit that area, and they say it's not safe. I didn't notice this, but we were there, and my dad spent about 5 minutes looking around. Oh, I did not go with him when he found several dead rattlesnakes lying on the ground. No signs of how they died. That is very unusual, and it just acted as a reminder for all the weird things he grew up hardened to living out there at that place. As I said, the energy is just so strange, and I've never been somewhere and felt an energy quite like that. It's like it was so thick in the air, you can almost taste it with your mouth. It's not quite electricity, but there's just something sitting in the air. It's a feeling like you know something's coming, a bad storm. I was lucky, however. I didn't have to experience any of what my dad did growing up. His business was already booming, so we had it pretty well off, and I grew up in a different state because as my dad got older, he eventually moved far away and out of state, running his own auto shop on the East Coast, where business was booming for him. The house, ranch, and all there is there today was sold many years ago, long after our visit there. I don't know the family that owns it or operates it now, but I guarantee the sightings of all the strange things that happened when my father was growing up still exists and currently goes on. I feel sorry for anybody that goes into that area or that currently owns that whole operation. I wish them the best of luck and hope they don't deal with anything like my grandfather and father did. I can't help but feel doubtful about all of it. If that land is truly cursed, and even maybe some of the natives won't venture around there, then they will no doubt not last very long. Who knows what kind of true dark magic and rituals took place on the land years and years before my grandfather ever built on it. My husband has been a park ranger for years now, and he's got a handful of scary things that have happened to him over his time just trying to maintain the park and do his job. One that always gets to him is when he was working on a segment of trail, fixing it. I don't recall precisely what he was doing, but he saw a rare sight that you pretty much never see in nature. A pack of wolves. Now, off in the distance, there was a large meadow. At the end of this meadow was a steep hill, littered with sparsely placed fir and oak trees. The wolves, an entire pack of them, were running at high speeds down this hill, then across the meadow. As my husband watched this happen in front of him, he saw that these wolves weren't just running to a destination in mind. They were clearly spooked. Spooked by something. The entire pack, mind you. That's when they were crossing the meadow, and a loud guttural scream came roaring far from the distance from the direction that they had just come from. Few of the wolves in front of the pack nervously turned their heads to look behind them in the course of the screaming. The scream lasted for a whopping 12 to 14 seconds, my husband had told me. Whatever made the screaming had to have a massive set of lungs. There's nothing out there in the woods that makes that kind of noise. Not to his knowledge. My husband also has extensive wilderness survival training and knows just about every animal that you can run into out there. He's never heard anything like that scream in his entire life. It scared him more than it scared the wolves that were running from it. I used to work in the Forest Service. I worked as a park ranger for many years and have my fair share of creepy tales and stories. In fact, I could honestly write a book about all my happenings during my time as a ranger, but I will leave you with just this one. My story took place in Yellowstone many, many years ago. I will not reveal the exact location because the park is so large, but people in that area have reported at the time strange noises and seeing large shadows moving around. As a park ranger, you have to learn to deflect information with what is real and what is not true. Lots of people see things because they get paranoid when they are outside of their element. It is a natural human occurrence. We had been warning people that the area might not be safe, but there was a couple that decided to not only camp in that area, but camp so far back beyond the trail where they were not allowed. Their tent and belongings were discovered only a few days later, off trail, by hikers. The disturbing part of the story was that they were missing. Their tent and all of their belongings were scattered, bloody, and torn up. It clearly looked like their campsite had been ravaged. It could have possibly been a mountain lion attack, or even a bear. About a quarter mile away from the campsite, we found something. Further away from the trail, we found an unknown and unidentified pile of scat. We weren't able to pinpoint it to a specific animal in the area, but it resembled that of huge dog poop. It did not resemble bear scat or mountain lion scat in any way. Samples were obtained and taken in for analysis. When the tests came back, there were no signs of any human remains in the scat. However, various other remains of animals were in this scat, like small pieces of bone, tissue, etc. Whatever poop it was, it clearly came from a carnivorous animal. If it was waste that came from a wolf, mind you, it was the most considerable wolf droppings I've ever seen in my life. Because this case involved 2 missing persons, the police had to be called in and an actual investigation followed after. The result of the investigation was that the couple were never found, even through extensive searching of the area for days afterward. I think this couple even made it into one of David Paulides' books, Missing 411, though I'm not too sure. This kind of thing happens far more than you would ever believe. To my knowledge, no bodies were ever recovered. Park Ranger here had a terrifying experience back in the fall of 2016 when the whole clown craze was going on. Let me explain. Back in early October, I was scheduled to work on a night shift. From my lookout point, I could see what appeared to be fire from a short distance away. When I went to go investigate, and I could get closer, it appeared that it was actually looking like a congregation of people holding torches. What in the hell? Why would there be people out here in the middle of the night? At least 50 of them holding torches in a semicircle. Now, the first thing that came to my mind is some kind of satanic ritual circle. That within itself is far above my pay grade, and I wasn't about to go and try and interrupt that. But I got a better look at the situation, and to my horror, it was some sort of ritual. What I was looking at was about 60 to 70 people dressed up in clown costumes. I'm talking full makeup and everything. Each one of them holding a torch, standing in a loose circle. They weren't talking or doing anything. I don't recall them making any noise whatsoever, just staring off into space or staring off blankly at each other. I ran back to my post immediately and called my boss and told him what was going on. He told me to not hesitate to phone the police if I considered anything to get out of hand. I quickly kept a look on the situation and saw that they were dividing into what looked like groups of 2 from what I could see and venturing off into the woods, all separately in every which direction, except the direction where my post was at. I don't know if there's some sort of clown ritual or some sort of cult that meets up and dresses like that, but the experience was weird. This was about 1:45 a.m. in the morning and lasted maybe the entirety of a whole 15 minutes before they all dissipated into groups of 2 off in the night wilderness. I have no explanation at all for what I saw that night, nor do I know anything about a clown cult. I'm a former park ranger Forest Service employee. I've spent far too much time out in the forest and have taken away too many awful memories from that career path. I've seen people who have gone out into the woods by themselves and hung themselves. I've seen people who got lost and died of exposure. I've been on search teams where we would go to rescue somebody, and they're not to be found anywhere. The worst is when you encounter missing children, and if you've ever heard or listened to anything about missing children, then you'll know and understand just how awful that is. It's a job that you have to learn to be hardened and put aside your emotions to deal with the task at hand. However, that's in regard to the emotional and traumatic side of things that you deal with on the job. Then, there's an entirely different segment of the job. The segment of the job that puts you in fear and harm's way. It's probably no surprise to you that there are things in the wilderness that we have no idea what or where they came from. I can't sit here and boast to you that I've seen stairs in the middle of the woods. No, nothing like that. No portals, nothing crazy. But that doesn't mean that I haven't spoken with colleagues that have, and have had vivid nightmares about things they've witnessed by themselves. For me, I had never truly felt terror until this specific day, where I was looking for an individual that had been reported last seen on this trail in an area. He had only been missing for a few hours, and I was checking the trail in which he was last seen on. I couldn't help but shake this feeling that something was watching me. At first, I figured it was the lost hiker, and maybe he was trying to get best my attention. I realized quickly that that wasn't the case. This, whatever I was feeling, had an energy to it. A really bad feeling. I could sense it in my stomach. You know how just like when you feel like you're in severe danger, you just have this pit in the bottom of your stomach, like you know something bad is about to take place. That's what I felt. I kept glancing over my shoulder in hopes this lost hiker would step out and show gratitude to me for finding him. Well, that never happened. Instead, I began to see moving shapes around me, hidden behind the trees. Maybe shapes aren't the best terminology to use here. It was more like blurred, opaque figures, if that makes sense. Like something was cloaked. You can't make this stuff up. I was really beginning to freak out. And against my better training and experience out in the woods, I began doing what years and years of training taught me not to do. Panic. I was coming up on a part of the trail where I know I could cut through and get back to the main base area in just a mile. The trail I was on looped around, and had I continued on with the trail, it would have taken me much more time to get back. Because I knew the trail so well and where my location was, I used that to my advantage and cut through the woods to make my way back swiftly. The feeling followed me, and I stopped glancing back over my shoulders to see if these opaque, blurred shapes were following me. Instead, I put my full focus on getting back to base and reporting that I did not find an individual. I safely made it back after hauling it like I had since training and trying to keep up with my superiors. The entire experience was nerve-wracking, and the rest of the day, I just felt so off. Drained of energy, as if I had just ran 12 miles and spent the entire day out in the hot, blazing sun. Let me explain this to you. At the time, I was in top physical prime condition. Naturally, I was a machine and walked 20,000 plus steps a day. I kept in great shape, and it took a lot for me to feel as drained as I did. I've not had a day on the job where I felt like this, or remotely close. A measly 2.5 mile stroll on a trail like that wasn't going to do that to me. I remember feeling severely dehydrated too. Like whatever was following me zapped me of my energy and hydration. I know fear can do a lot of things to you, but that seemed to be an overkill, drastically. I don't know what things I saw in the woods stalking me, but I felt nothing but bad energy radiating off of these things. I felt like I was a deer being hunted, and that if I stopped for more than a minute, I was done for. I've told several of my colleagues about the same story, and to my horror, they have similar stories with very similar beings, as they call them. Maybe I'll share some of them with you sometime when I get more time to sit down and write it all out. Thanks. So, I went over to a friend's house, and he lives close to a national forest. We decided to start a fire and just relax for a bit outside. He had to go see what his sister was doing and walked off. I stayed and watched the fire, and it slowly died to embers in about 5 minutes, right after he left. It was a blazing fire, and no way that it should have went out that fast. So, it goes out, I put music on, and I start to hear almost like joints popping, kind of like bubble wrap. I thought nothing of it, but it kept getting closer. I turn around with my flashlight, and I see this creature with no eyes, ears, or mouth. Basically, a crawler. I jump up and drop my phone, quickly run to my free porch, and look back, and it just stares at me, and I see his fingers around each of the tree. Fingers 8 inches or longer. Then it bolts off, and it was so deformed that it ran like a cheetah, without making noises. I tell my friend, and we go look for his sister, and hear noises like voices and animal sounds around us, and keep seeing things. We get them, and they don't believe us. We walk back to the house, and everything seems fine, but after a while, my back feels hit and aches a little. We lift up my shirt, and there are scratch marks, but no blood. It looked almost like whip marks, and me and my friend are nail biters. I didn't feel any pain while we were looking. This is possibly the scariest thing I've ever experienced. My friend said that he has seen that creature twice, and is not sure if it is a skinwalker, but it is the best thing you can match to it. His dad has never seen it, but hears stuff all the time, and the animals, well, they will start freaking out when nobody is around. His sister says we are messing with them, and I don't really care, since I have a clear conscience on finding them. Also, I had to walk about 3 miles at 2 a.m., and I'm 250 pounds. My fat butt is not doing this for fun if I see danger. I'm also working on my weight, so I'm glad I wasn't 300 pounds like I once was. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. and there is a stretch of road between me and my girlfriend's house that goes through some ranches and thick wooded area. My girlfriend and I were driving back towards my house around 10 p.m., and while I was rounding a corner near the beginning of the woods, I swerved as I saw what looked like a tall, skinny, pale-skinned person standing by the side of the road and walking into the road. When I looked in my rearview mirror to see what it was, I couldn't see anything. But after I asked my girlfriend about it, she was clearly shaken and she said that she saw it too. We decided to stop talking about it for the time being and continue to drive deeper into the woods back home. About 15 minutes down the road, we came across a fresh deer carcass on the side of the road. And while I noticed the deer carcass alone as I was focusing on the narrow road, my girlfriend swears that she saw the same figure bent over the carcass. I drove by the carcass for weeks after when I went back to her house. We've both seen a lot of weird stuff on that small stretch of road, including more on that specific drive, but nothing else that I think I'd be worth mentioning or could be a crawler. I'm not sure where it came from. No caves I'm aware of are around, or if it was more than one out there, but I know to always be aware of what else is on that road with me late at night. So, for a while now, I've been calling crawlers skin gates. I feel like they go by a lot of names, so I don't know what to call it. My sighting occurred back in 2013, at the end of summer. I was about 20 years old. When this happened, I had no clue that these things existed in folklore, or even horror movies. I don't watch horror movies still to this day, because I feel like they just messed with my head. So what I saw, I had nothing to base off. I thought I was crazy for a while. This happened at my parents' house out in the country. They have a couple of acres of land and orchards are right behind them. Hundreds of acres surrounding them, and about 4 miles away, there's a really good-sized river. There's also canals everywhere out there. My family grows weed, and it was about time to harvest. So, on this night, my dad and uncle decided to go out and asked my cousin and his friends to watch over the crop. I decided to tag along because I wanted to hang out with my cousin's friend, who, at the time, I had a big crush on. So we're out there, probably an hour or two, and we hear commotion out in the orchards. It doesn't sound like any animals we know, and it was pretty loud for a couple of seconds. It dies down, and we waited for about a minute or two to go check it out. 2 people stay, and the rest of us decided to go see what's up. It's a full moon out that night, and for me, it seems pretty much like daytime. It's easy to see, and everything is lit up. Orchards usually have a couple of dirt paths that are a bit bigger than the rows themselves, for easier transport for machines, sprayers, and whatnot. So we take one and walk up it a ways. I squat here, and there to see below the tree line to see if I can make out any humans or cars that are not supposed to be there. And there's nothing. We're about 2 orchards in and decide to head back. Right then, I get the worst feeling in my gut. It's like this primal fear that makes me want to run, but I felt frozen. I looked to my right, about 4 to 5 rows in, and I saw this thing. It was tall and gangly, about 8 feet tall, and it was walking parallel to us. I could see its side profile of its face, and I make out sunken cheeks and what looks like hollow eye sockets, but deep. Its skin is a grayish white, and the skin texture reminded me of a dolphin skin. It was flesh and bones, but not in a starving way. More like how it's built naturally. I don't know why, but it never once looked at me. I really wanted to run, but I felt like if I did, it would have given chase. So I stayed next to my friends and didn't say anything to them, because they like trouble. We rounded a corner and it disappeared from my view. I questioned myself a lot. My most vivid memory, though, is seeing the changing shadows on its face and head while walking through the trees. I haven't seen once since, and I hope I never do. Makes me question, though, what else is out there that I don't want to find out. My dog typically sleeps right around my arm. His head rests on my shoulder, so he is facing the window. When I sleep, the back of my head faces the window. Anyway, it was just nearing 5:30 a.m. The dog wakes me up with extremely aggressive growling at the window. This growling I've only ever heard when he fights with other dogs. I was roused and I tried to calm him back to sleep. Within a couple of seconds, the growling turned into howls and barks. I looked outside the window and my heart rate shot through the roof. The property line from my house to my neighbors is roughly 60 to 70 yards. Is 60 to 70 yards. I competed at state for track for the 100 open, 400, and 2 relays, so I can confirm this creature's speed was shocking. It covered the yard in no less than 3 seconds. Gray skin, long arms almost down to its knees, an elongated face, and anorexic-looking legs. It ran by swinging its arms like, I don't know, like a buffoon, not a runner's form. After collecting myself, I burst into my dad's room. I startled him, but told him to get outside with me. We briskly got outside with handguns as I tried to explain what I saw. There were no footprints or marks, as white-tailed deer are frequently in our yard. 37 years ago, my mother and I saw an entity outside looking in at us through the window. It was hairless, pale white, huge bulging black eyes, and it had teeth that were very small, very well spaced, skinny and pointed, almost kind of like an anglerfish. We hid for hours until we heard my father drive towards the house. We both looked out the window to see the being stand up from behind a wall. It was much taller than a human. It was hiding behind that wall, and I believe waiting for us to come outside. My father drove up the driveway, and we saw the silhouette of its body from the back. It was hunched over, staring at the car. My father saw it in the headlights, and what it looked like perfectly. He drove at it, and it ran away into the brush around the house. It never made a sound. It seemed smart, but cautious, and the overwhelming feeling I got that night, that it was vicious and very violent. My parents spoke with police as we were so horrified about the encounter. After speaking to police, or the KGB, we were relocated and forced to never speak of the event to anybody. Within 30 hours, I was living in a new home, nearly 100 kilometers away. I have searched for so many years for an explanation. I've spoken with government officials. I have interviewed with people who live near our home, and that was about 10 years ago. I still have no answers. I work in the outdoor field and lead trips regularly. I once led a trip to the top of Mount Sterling in North Carolina. It's a tough climb to get to the top, about 6 miles from the nearest road. I was leading a group of 8 middle school kids and had 1 co-instructor. We were camping out on top of the mountain, and it was a beautiful night with a full moon. The kids and the other co-instructor went to bed in their tents. I chose to spend the night in a hammock. I was really into a book I was reading, so I stayed up and read until about 10:30 p.m. I turned my headlamp off to settle in for the night. Everything around me was rather bright from the moon, and from the position I was in, I could see down the trail we had hiked to get to the top. I laid there, enjoying the scenery, and noticed something moving on the trail. Bears are common in the area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there was somebody hiking up the trail with no headlamp on or any gear. I was just frozen, watching this person move closer to our camp. They arrived at the top of the mountain, where we were, and just stopped. I watched as what appeared to be a man surveying our camp. I really could only see the outline of him. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes, but may have been 10. He then turned, sat down under a tree facing our camp. He was sitting up in a way that I knew he wasn't trying to sleep. He just sat there, staring at our camp. I had no idea what to do, so I decided to wait it out. I waited, just staring at the man while he stared at my camp. This went on till about 3:30 a.m. Then, he stood up, took a moment to survey my camp a few minutes longer, and then went back down the trail he came upon. I, to this day, have no idea what that was all about, but it freaked me out. I was paranoid that we were being followed for the rest of the trip. A couple of years ago, I went camping with my brother and old roommate of mine. This was in one of the national forests in Oregon. We were pretty high up, kind of near an old ghost town. Not really a dangerous area, but there are a lot of black bears and some cougars. I set up my hammock with the tarp draped over to keep the rain out. Then, I got pretty drunk and went to bed. Well, since I drank my weight in beer, I woke up in the middle of the night and had to pee. I lifted up the tarp to peek out with a flashlight, and that's when I saw two eyes staring back at me. They were about 20 feet away. I was using one of those stupid $2 hardware store LED lights, so it didn't throw a beam. So I couldn't see what was behind the eyes. All I could see was that they were far apart. My first instinct was to turn off the light and stay where I was. But it was so close, and then I wouldn't be able to see it. We had 3 guns, but I left mine in the truck. I came to the conclusion that the only thing to do was to stay perfectly still and keep the light on so I could see it. So, I draped my other leg out of the hammock and was ready to bolt for the truck if it charged me. I stayed in this position for what felt like forever, until I noticed that the eyes had not moved at all. So I took a chance. I slowly got out of the hammock and began moving around the eyes, keeping about 20 feet between us. I was moving towards the truck. Once I got to the side, I saw it. It was a pair of binoculars, left open, sitting on a stump. With a light, they reflected just like a pair of eyes. And in my half-drunk state, it never occurred to me that this could possibly be it. I put the binoculars away and went to sleep. I know that this isn't actually a dangerous experience. I've actually encountered wild animals before, but this is by far the most scared I've ever been, and for the most amount of time, of course. I'm a seasonal ranger for my local forest district. Despite the fact that I live in a fairly suburban area, the forest preserves still make up about 12% of the county, with much of the property being heavily wooded. Not far out wilderness, but pretty secluded in some areas. Being a seasonal employee, I've been on the job for a bit over a month now, but in my short time here, I've found 3 things. Number 1, a dead man in a tree. The rest of the rangers say they find about 1 suicide a year, so here was the one for the year. When we go around opening parks each day, we drive through to make sure everything is okay. In this instance, I was driving through and had just lost sight of the road when I saw a man hanging from a tree in a clearing. He had hung himself. I called the cops and the coroner. Friggin' coroner took an hour to show up, and he was the only one with a ladder long enough to cut the guy down. So I stared at a dead guy in a tree for about an hour. Number 2, crazed, drugged up, naked man running around a parking lot. Took me and 3 other rangers to catch the guy, and when we finally caught him, found out he had multiple cuts across his body from running through brush and rock lodged firmly up his, well, I'll let you guess. Number 3, headless deer. Normally, when a pack of coyotes take down a deer, yes, we have a bunch of coyotes around here, they leave bite marks all over the body, along with torn off flesh everywhere. But the head was cleanly sliced off and placed directly next to the body. meaning this is something created by human intervention. We still haven't figured out that one yet, and I've only been on the job for 5 weeks. I live in northeast Oklahoma, and I consider myself a camping and fishing enthusiast. One spring night, me and 2 friends decided to go fishing. It's around midnight, and we're going to a place that was once a maintained primitive camping area. This is not a remote location, but it's not very well known either. As we approach the turnoff for our spot, we see another vehicle slowly turning out off of it and proceeding in the way in which we came. We pass them, and a friend says how he figured no one else would be around. We get to our spot, get our gear out, and begin to prepare. But as we chat, drink a few beers, we all notice an unspoken easiness. Something is just not right. Usually, I'm a trooper, fishing until the sun comes up, but I'm the first to crack. I explain to my friends how I feel, that we should leave, and I just have a bad feeling. They agree. We load up. While slowly driving through the old campground, we notice some brightly glowing embers in an area where nobody has been. My friend driving stops without even thinking and goes for a look. He is startled, telling us to come see. What we saw was the remains of 3 crosses, made of wood that would stand about 12 inches if upright. But they had been burned, along with a small campfire. And to make it even better, all were lying on freshly turned soil, which resembled a freshly dug grave. We freaked, got the hell out of there fast. Thank you, sweet baby Jesus. We are home free, we all thought. When we approached the exit of the old campground, we noticed a vehicle parked on the side of the road. We passed it, and we all realize it's the same car we passed on the way in. There was nobody in the car. They had doubled back and were likely watching us, waiting to do who knows what. Not a pro, but more than 1,000 days in the backcountry over the past decade. I have always been drawn to the wild. It seems like home, and I generally know my neighbors out there. Not afraid to be in the deep woods, in the dark. I love my woods. One sunny weekend afternoon, I had dirt biked up an old mining road. It gained a couple thousand feet from the valley floor towards one of the ridges of the Cascades. When the road gave out near the bottom of a high basin, I put my backpack and started off cross-country toward the ridge. It was still heavily forested, old growth and old cut fading in another 1,000 feet, into those scraggly wind-blown ones near the top. About 20 minutes in, at about a half mile up from me, near the tree line, I heard this thumping sound. It was very odd, so I stopped to listen carefully. It sounded like a big, solid branch was being whacked against a solid tree. I use the term solid because the hits were powerful. One or both of the pieces of wood were hard and dry. The wood resonated and rang on impact as dry wood will. I couldn't get over the power though. It sounded like somebody was swinging a 4-inch post. Weird, right? Well, it gets better. This someone sounded like they were trying to communicate. The thumping had a very complex and well-defined pattern. And here's the weirdest part. The thumping signal occasionally became very rapid, like what a drummer could do if they were noodling around with a stick. But I swear, it sounded like a 4-inch post was being treated lightly as a drumstick. I listened for maybe 5 minutes, just fascinated with the sound. This code and the power of it. Then, the drumming suddenly stopped, and I kind of woke up to the fear of this unknown thing out there. I had my pistol, I had my bear spray, and my knife. I really only fear cougars, and even then, I figured they'll have a bad day trying to take me down. Still, the silence as I stared into the forest ahead seemed loaded, and I turned on my heels and left that valley. That place and that experience just gave me the chills, and that high valley won't ever see my shadow again. I have read stories about some of the native people around here having valleys that they just wouldn't go into. I can now easily understand how these legends get started. About 20 years ago now, I dated an Inuit girl who was living in Washington, D.C. I had just graduated college with a bachelor's in anthropology, so I was absolutely fascinated with her stories of her childhood in Alaska. Anyway, one night over drinks, the conversation moves to skinwalkers. I had never heard of them, so of course I wanted to know more. I never thought of her as a superstitious person, but this topic was clearly unsettling to her. Basically, she was of the mind that she wasn't sure if she believed in them, but they played such a prominent role in her cultural upbringing and were so terrifying that, real or not, it was better to not dig too far into them. A few days later, we were in the DuPont Circle, or the DC, when the topic pops into my head again. We were on our way to get lunch, and I brought it up. She got pretty mad and said that it was stupid to talk about them, and when there were so many people around, because there could be one nearby. I laughed and played it off, when all of a sudden, this guy across the street, facing away from me, stopped and stared directly at me. I felt terror to my core, and I can't explain it, but my urge to get away was overwhelming. There was no possible way for him to have heard me, but his gaze did not waver. He was absolutely looking at me. Even as I'm writing this, I'm getting chills. I genuinely am pretty skeptical and try to find a logical explanation to things, but whatever that was scares me to this day. I'm Rick Martinez, a truck driver, coming back up from Utah, going into Nevada. I pulled over to update my logs and got up on top of a hill to a rest area. Nothing but desert all around me. No cars, no nothing. As I was writing into my logbook, I felt like somebody was staring at me. So I looked up and saw this old man standing there, all raggedy, with a long beard, just staring at me. So I rolled down my window and asked him, "Are you okay?" And he would not answer. So I repeated, "Are you all right? Do you need help? Do you want some water?" He still would not answer me. So I opened the door and stood on my step and said, "I'm not coming down. You need to come over here." He wouldn't answer. So I told him, "Okay, old man, last chance. If you need help, tell me now." So I got back in my truck, closed the door, put my truck in gear, and started to roll off. He started to walk alongside the truck. I'm thinking I'm going to end up running this guy over, so I just said, "Let me get out of here." As I pick up speed, he starts running alongside of the truck. And I'm thinking this is freaking crazy. This old guy is out of his mind. I began picking up more speed, getting ready to get back on the highway, and I turned to look to make sure I'm not going to run this old guy over. And he's not there. What I see instead is a coyote running next to me, and that coyote kept up with the truck for at least a couple of blocks, until finally I started pulling away from him. I didn't want to look in the rearview mirror anymore. I just wanted to get away. This was midwinter, so about early January, and my cousin and I were out in the woods playing. Mind you, we were 6 and 7 at the time, and we stumbled upon a carcass. Now, this carcass was of a robin bird, freshly killed, but the way it was killed was unlike anything neither him or I had ever seen before. Up until this point, I had been hunting with my dad every year since I was about 4, and I had seen dead birds and eaten carcasses before. It was torn in two, one half not too far away from the other, and its entrails had been eaten, but not anything else on it like anything conventional. Now we get back to playing, and noticed other oddities in the small patch of woods we were in. The hill next to his barn was steep and snow-covered, but every so often there were patches of bird feathers, almost ritualistically plotted all around to mark something, a territorial boundary, I'd presume. But anyway, further down the small trail that led to the road uphill, we seen it. It was a humanoid, thin, brown, hairless, and soulless. It had deep, dark pools for eyes like craters in its face, and was built so wrong. Its arms were ungodly long and slim to a point where you could see bone. Now at this point, the tough guy in me and my cousin thought we were going to begin to yell and throw our hands as we charged it. It was gone in a matter of seconds, bolting in the tree line, into the road, and gone the other side. After this, my cousin and I ran inside, almost began to cry, questioning on what we had just experienced. The story, however, does not end there. Fast forward to 2016. My cousin is in the living room, and he's watching TV. The dog had to go out for a dump or something, so he let it out and watched her. That's when this thing makes itself known. In the tree line, it leers up and looks dead at him. But when it noticed the rushing dog coming at it, barking like hell, it hunched over and froze. The dog stopped suddenly right in front of it and began to sniff, clearly confused. Soon enough, the dog walked away, crapped, and was let back inside. This thing glanced at my cousin one more time and walked off. It's 2020 now, and my cousin had only one more experience like this since, and that was when he was with his girlfriend. They were ready to get down and dirty with it by his car in a bigger patch of secluded woods by his house when he heard this noise, similar to a bear, but with a more human tone to it. After hearing this, they hauled butt back to his car, and ever since then, he refused to go back. After having an in-depth conversation with him, recollecting all of this information, we agreed to try and hunt a skinwalker, or a wendigo, or something like that. Take my story as you will, but I just want to ask you, what the hell did he see? What the hell stalks the rural woods of New Hampshire to such an extent? Mind you, when I seen this thing, it was about the size of myself, a 7-year-old. When my cousin seen it, he said it was much larger, yet retained the hairless and skinny physique. Should we hunt and try to kill it, or leave it be? Whatever it was intelligent, ritualistic, and cunning. I'm just curious to find out if it was a skinwalker or not, and take my word for it, because I do believe most of these things hunt and stalk the rural areas of the North American wilderness. My cousin once told me about a time he and a friend heard what he honestly thinks was a skinwalker. I believe they may have also had a glimpse on a creature, but I'm not sure. Now, my cousin is a big guy. He's not scared easily, and this time, he was truly scared, which is concerning. Anyway, he and his buddy were camping and went for a bike ride. They heard something in front and heard noises, and then they backed away and heard it run around and get in front of them, or close to it. So they both gunned it, hearing the creature following them. My cousin says the creature sounded like it was made of sticks, and I believe he saw something though. He didn't describe the thing to me. There was another time that him and a different friend heard a large creature walk past them at night. The creature, they say, was massive and made strange noises. They also said they heard birds chirping around it, but it sounded fake. The birds, I mean. The area they were in was basically a massive hill, and it was all downhill, which was basically a 90-degree drop, meaning it had to be massive for them to hear it that close. This was 7 months ago, but I still haven't gotten any answers from anybody, so I'll share it and see what you guys think. So I just got back from my walk. It's about 7 p.m. for me. The sun was setting, and it's already overcast, so it's a bit darker than usual. And for a little background, I live in Phoenix, Arizona. One of those houses, kind of away from the main city. Out right by a mountain preserve, I guess you could say. It's basically connected to it. A very cool area, but very unsettling at night. That's where I go on my walks. About 15 minutes away from the house, right in front of me, I see this strange-looking creature about 10 feet away from me, seem to be floating, completely motionless and hard to make out exactly what it looked like, but it appeared to have glowing red eyes, one snapped horn and another full horn on its head, long black demonic arms with sharp-looking claws, wearing a dark black, raggedy cloak. I looked at it for about 2 whole seconds before it vanished, almost like fog. Then it appeared again further down my walk, about 5 to 6 minutes later, even further than before, almost like it was watching me from a distance. I was listening to my playlist at the time, and suddenly, a loud, I mean loud, horrible high-pitched blood-curdling scream blasted through my headphones in the middle of the song, and the creature vanished. It was the loudest scream that I've ever heard, but it was probably because it was directly into my ears, but still, it made me drop to my knees. After that, it seemed to vanish. I didn't see it again, but the rest of the way home, I felt a presence, as well as being watched. I've had lots of encounters with other creatures, but this one was probably the most terrifying I've had. I've speculated it being a skinwalker, or even a banshee, but would definitely like to hear other opinions. Me and a friend at the time were hiking in the Angeles National Forest. My friend was just at a boot camp, U.S.A, and we started hiking as often time would allow. We were hiking down a small stream bed that went downhill. The stream was all dried up, and it was mostly rock hopping until we got to the bottom of the hill. At one point, there is a small section off to the side that is just dirt and makes for a much easier walk down to the bottom. When we got to the bottom, we hiked a bit more, but as the sun started to go down, we headed back up the same hill creek bed. I followed my own boot tracks back up, as I was tired of rock hopping while going up. The smell in the air was horrible, like rotten eggs or a portable toilet. I then noticed on one of my tracks laid a dead ground squirrel, right over my boot track. I pointed this out to my friend, and as soon as I did, a loud banging over a short hillside was heard. It was coming from about 35 to 50 yards away from us. It sounded as if a large log was being hit against a tree. I looked at where the noise was coming from and noticed the tops of the trees were swaying back and forth. All this time of the swaying of the trees, the pounding on them could be heard. Then the pounding stopped, and a loud groan scream was heard from the same area as the pounding of the trees. I have never heard anything like it. I've heard mountain lions, black bear. This was nothing like that, and was very, very loud, to the point that where it was damn scary. My friend asked if we should go look over the small hillside to see what was making the noise. I said no way, and he agreed. When we started walking away, the banging and the screaming would stop, but as soon as we stopped, it would then proceed with the groan and screaming, and the trees would start swaying. We finally got out of there, and my friend did not want to talk about what happened. This is what you might call a stretch, but here goes anyway. About 15 years ago, when I was 17 or 18, I went on a hike with a friend trying to reach Smith Mountain on the edge of the San Gabriel Wilderness. We made it up to the saddle where the trail goes downhill into the wilderness, and where we were supposed to leave the trail and go south of the mountain, and decided we didn't feel like going any further. I'm assuming we rested for a while, and I remember just talking and hanging out. As we were getting up and ready to go, we heard a strange noise coming from the bushes nearby. We stopped talking and listened and it was a very low sort of growl, snuffling sound. My first thought was that it was probably a bear, but that ultimately I had no idea what it was, and it sounded like it was growling at us. The bushes along the trail were very high, such so that we couldn't see through them. It scared the hell out of us, and so we quickly hoofed it back down the trail. I'm not sure if we ever spoke about it again, except to maybe say I wonder what it was, that it was scary. But afterwards, I actually looked through the field guides trying to figure out what was making the noise. I knew that bears, mountain lions, and bobcats all relatively are prevalent in that part of San Gabriel Mountains, so assumed it was probably one of those. But after browsing around and seeing several sightings near that wilderness area, I'm beginning to wonder. In retrospect, although it could be my overactive imagination, it sounded a bit ape-like, very low-pitched, so that we almost couldn't hear it at all, and we had to ask each other, "Do you hear that?" Take it as you must. I just think it's interesting in the context of the other sightings. I only wish I could remember any more details, and that we had the cojones to hang around longer and to check it out further. In 1976, while night hunting for bobcats on the fringe of San Gabriel Wilderness, I called in a Bigfoot while using a dying rabbit call. I heard it scream so loud that the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I got goosebumps all over my whole body. I've been hunting now for 34 years, and besides hunting 8 of the 11 western states, I've also hunted deep in the interior of Mexico, and I have never heard anything like that before. It was the only time I have ever been truly frightened. Even though I had a high-powered rifle, I knew by the sheer volume of the blood-curdling scream that whatever it was too big to kill with my 243 caliber bullet. It sounded like it was mad at me and kept moving to my right, trying to get downwind of me. I figured that my very powerful aircraft landing light that I was using to hunt with must have blinded him and hurt his eyes, because he was circling me, trying to win me. He never looked my way, thus allowing me to catch his glowing eyes. This is the first of 3 so-called sightings. Me and my fishing buddy, Greg, were fishing the backside of Morris Dam, knocking stuff out of smallmouth bass and an occasional huge trout or crappie. It's not legal to trespass there, so we were very quiet and did not use lights. We are one with nature, so to speak. At around 4 in the morning, we started back to the car, a quarter-mile walk through dense brush, across the river, up to waist deep. We used deer trails, like tunnels, to get through the thick brush. We grabbed our hefty stringer, no fish story, and headed into the bush, without really speaking. We knew the routine well. About 50 yards into the bush, Greg and I both noticed that someone, a human, was walking in front of us, about 20 feet ahead. We both stopped. The footsteps took 2 more steps, and then stopped. Greg and I looked at each other, surprised, and simultaneously drew our buck knives. We couldn't see anything. We proceeded cautiously, our knives drawn. The footsteps continued in front of us. After about 30 feet, we came to the edge of a clearing and stopped. 2 more steps, and it stopped again, only this time in the middle of the clearing. We looked at each other, looked back at it, and simultaneously said, "Who's there?" It turned 90 degrees up the river and took off running through dense brush in the black of night, like a halfback for the Rams, like no human can. This early 1970s sighting was not of my own. I was a boy when my brother-in-law of that day and 1 or 2 of his hunting friends had an excellent and fairly long-term sighting, both via their eyes through high-powered rifle scopes. However, I can relate some of this information to you. In fact, I spoke with my ex-brother-in-law about this earlier this evening, because I happened upon it and wanted to explore this encounter. What is very significant is that Sam and Dawn had every opportunity to shoot this animal, or person, and thought about it, but could not because it looked too human. Only 3 days later, Bigfoot reports hit the news. My father and Sam, aka Sandy, in front of me, took out a forest map, and Sam became quiet as the new sightings were only 15 miles from his encounter, and in the direction the creature was traveling. The newer sightings, as I recall, put the creature near Pear Blossom, on the other side of the mountains. I remember a news report of 1,000 people lined up across the desert looking for anything, and they did find some hair on a barbed wire fence. To this day, I know of no one having reported this first encounter 3 days prior. Another significant item is that in those days, bear season and deer season overlapped, or was one and the same. At first, they thought this might be a deformed bear. They had bear tags, as they witnessed this being walking on 2 legs, just like any human, and appeared to be around 8 feet tall. They were a few hundred yards away on the other side of the canyon. I don't remember the name of the canyon, but the rifle scopes allow them to see this clearly enough that viewing the face and shape, they cannot decide if this was an animal or a human. I remember Sandy, or Sam, saying it looked kind of like a monkey man. The animal person seemingly did not know they were there. They had bear tags and thought about shooting the creature, but as I said, could not make themselves to do it. I recall Sam telling my father that it had to be a bear because it dropped down to all fours when it climbed the steeper terrain. My father asked Sam, "How did you guys climb it?" The reply was the same as a deformed bear. About then, my brother-in-law was no longer jovial regarding the sighting and preferred not to discuss the incident. Until now, I have more or less left the man alone about it. Today, he is a plant manager for a large trailer company. Don still lives in Baldwin Park, California, but may be moving to San Diego. I seldom cross paths with Don, nor have I ever pursued the matter with him. If anybody is interested. I was mining on the creek when some movement caught my eye. As I stood up, I saw clear as day a Bigfoot peering from behind a tree. The hair on my neck stood straight up on the back of my neck as I moved back towards across the creek, away from it. As I did, I slipped on mossy rocks, fell back, and banged my arm up pretty bad, which required medical attention later on, keeping a close eye on what it was doing. I know exactly what I saw, as well as it saw me. We were talking about a distance of 60 yards. My mining partner was upstream from us, and it knew that too, as he kept looking upstream looking for him. My friend must have spooked it my way. As it spotted me, already acting nervous, it leapt up and climbed over some rocks and was gone. As it knew to stay low, like it was in firefight, staying as much out of sight as possible. In panic and injured, I was heading up the trail as fast as I could. The behavior I observed was so fascinating that this thing was very tactful and knew exactly what it was doing. Quite the sure-footed creature. I believe I had a Dogman encounter a few months back, right when the quarantine started happening. I was going to take my woman out on a date night since we hadn't gotten to do anything right when the quarantine hit. So, I took her out for a night to go look out at the stars. It was late April, early May, so things were beginning to warm up, just a pinch, which meant that nighttime wouldn't be freezing cold anymore. She and I got in my truck, packed a couple of blankets, and set sail for about 20 minutes away, closer to the mountain where there's a larger meadow that I had been thinking about laying in and watching the stars with her. We pulled off to the side of the road, got flashlights, and made our way out to the middle of this large meadow, and laid our blankets down. It was a tad chilly, but not too bad. We wore light jackets, and we had a blanket to cover us up, so we were okay to snuggle and watch the skies together. The night was actually pretty clear. We could see all the stars and everything perfectly. Now, I want to lay this out for you so you have a better picture of my entire situation. The truck is about 100 feet away, give or take, in our view. We're in a large open meadow with very tall grass, and there are no woods around us that are necessarily close. We felt very safe and comfortable. The night was quiet. only the low hum of crickets, so we didn't really notice anything going awry at first listen. My girlfriend started acting funny after a while before she sat up, acting all sorts of paranoid and looking around. I asked her, "What? You freak the cops are going to show up and bust us?" She tells me to shh, and we both listen closely. We can hear something big moving slowly in the grass close by. It would be a slight shuffling noise and then stop. Then it would start up again and then stop. We're both looking at one another, mouthing, "What animal is that?" It sounded really big. I continued lying there, listening closely, while my girlfriend was trying to be as sly as possible and still look out the night if she could see anything, but she couldn't. Whatever was shuffling and making moving noise in the grass had been getting closer and closer to us, inch by inch. I can't say exactly how close or how far away it got, but it felt like it was getting too close for comfort. When you start to feel in danger like that, you just can't help but let your mind race to things like a possible serial killer coming to hurt you, or maybe some sort of crazed rapist. I know that's a bit drastic, but there's no reason for anybody should be out here in the meadow at 10:30 at night. There's nothing out here, which is why in my mind, it was the perfect spot for a little date with the woman. Well, I would soon learn that it was not a person like I had initially thought. My girlfriend began staring off, telling me that she thinks she could see something, and she asked me to sit up and look. So, I slowly sit up, and I look in the direction that she's pointing at, and all I could see and make out is the tips of these taller ears. I need to tell you though, that even though it was nighttime, and it being 10:30 at night, the sky was clear enough and with nearly a full moon. That's relevant because there's plenty of light from the moon, enough to see as clear as the day, and these tall perky ears, maybe about 30 feet away in the grass. We didn't know exactly what we were looking at, and then all of a sudden, this head pops out of the tall grass, looking directly at us. I had to cover my mouth, but my girlfriend just starts screaming frantically. What I saw, I will confidently say that there is no animal out there that looks like this, or should look like this. It was not natural, to say the least. The best way I'll describe it, and how this thing looked, was a devilish-looking hyena. Its face was pulled back, almost contorted, but it really resembled that of a Botox hyena. From what I can tell in the low lighting conditions, it was a dark gray, and it faded to a lighter gray. Again, the stars and nearly full moon provided enough light that we can see initial details. It opened its mouth, and it was full of triangular-shaped teeth that came to a very fine point. It had these eyes that glowed to a bright yellow, that almost resembled eyes if you were to shine a light into them, except there's no light being shined into them. What made my mind even go more towards the hyena option is that it seemed to have a pure and huge evil grin on its face. I know that might sound hokey, but I'm being real with you here. There's no mistaking that whatever this creature was staring right back at us, within a second, it opened its mouth and showed its teeth, all while maintaining its grin. Quickly, I ducked back down, thinking smart, and pulled my girlfriend down with me. I grabbed her head close to mine, and I whispered in her ear, "When I tell you to run, you need to run." I changed positions at the runner stance and got ready to bolt for the truck. Screw the blankets, I had a flashlight in my hand and that's all we needed. I turned my head towards her and I whispered, "Run!" Her and I took off running faster than we ever have towards the truck. Not even a second goes by, and that thing that we saw begins the chase. How do I know this? Because I heard this huge trampling sound behind us in the grass, and it was closing in on us very, very quickly. As it was trampling through the grass, I could hear even more and more just how incredibly massive this animal was. And in that moment, I'm telling my girlfriend to run, and actually reaching my truck. I don't think I was thinking much of anything other than trying to survive in that moment. This thing sounded heavy. With each trample, you could hear the thud and feel the thuds in the ground. When you're in a fear like that, and you're in the moment, there really is no thought process. You're running on pure adrenaline and emotion. Fear will drive you to do great things, and in this case, it drove me and her to survive. As I'm recalling it, I can give you more vivid details because it's something I will never forget. It's an experience that will haunt me and my girlfriend for the rest of our lives, probably. Unless we undergo some sort of trauma therapy and are able to get over it, but please, what therapist is going to take us seriously? That's just not an option. Neither my girlfriend nor I am what you would call a runner by any means. Neither of us are sports people, and I did not do anything close to track in high school. I am not a fat, lazy slouch either, but I should not be able to clear 100 feet in that short amount of time as I did. I had attributed all of that to sheer adrenaline, and surprisingly, my girlfriend was able to keep up. I'm very thankful that I did not lock my truck that night. I usually do, but I must have forgotten, and so we hop right in the truck, and I didn't even bother once looking back. Like clockwork, and somehow in that crazy chaotic situation, having total control, I hopped right in the driver's side, slammed the key into the ignition, and I floored it. No seatbelt, nothing. There was no time. I don't know if whatever animal this was is trying to kill us, or if it was just trying to chase us off, or what its intent clearly was. This animal was much larger than us and faster, and I honestly believe in my heart of hearts that if it wanted to clear the distance entirely between me and my girlfriend, it could have, very easily. But no, it stayed very close behind us at an even length, and even let us get into my truck and leave. But it did not try once to attack us. Once we reached my truck, I never looked back to see if it was there or how close this was. Thinking back, I can just imagine it reaching out and trying to grab one of us, and I'm thankful that that did not happen. Was it clearly a bluff charge? Was it just trying to run us off the meadow? I don't know. What I can tell you is what was supposed to be a romantic date with my woman, watching the stars in a peaceful nature meadow, was ruined forever. That will forever be a haunting memory, constantly reoccurring. I know when most people send you stories, they try and answer all the who, what, when, where, and why. But I don't really have any of that, and I'm sorry for that. I wish I could tell you where it came from, or if it was maybe there before we even got down to the spot. Was it hiding in the grass the entire time? Or perhaps did it sneak up on us without us knowing? I still wonder what its true intentions were, and had my girlfriend not sat up and seen it, how close would it have gotten without us ever knowing? I don't even want to go there and think about that, because it's just too scary. For me, I feel like talking about it and even typing it out is therapeutic and helps me through it. It's a very scary recount for me. My girlfriend refuses to talk about it at all. Anytime I bring it up, she's quick to change the subject and won't even acknowledge that it ever happened. I haven't tried once to invite her out on a date that involves going out anywhere near a meadow or watching stars. Maybe again in the future, in the bed of my truck at our parents' driveway. But I think it's going to take some time before we can do something like that and not feel completely on edge. My girlfriend and I are not paranoid people to begin with. I feel like it was our gut instinct telling us something was wrong. Even though initially I never felt anything wrong, it was my girlfriend who told me that she felt something was wrong, which is why she stood up initially and started looking around. Thank goodness for her instinct, man. I believe it saved both of us. Had it just been me, we would both be dead. I guess for now, I'll just call it a wild hyena creature, because that's the only thing I know what to call it. I don't know if you've ever heard of creatures like this, and I'm really sorry for turning this email into a mini novella, but the more information I can give you, the more I feel better about it. Feel free to read this to your audience if you want. Maybe they might know what happened upon us that very night. About 20 years ago, when I went fishing in a small creek not too far away from where my house is at now, I saw a creature that does not belong in this world. This creature is called the Dogman, and I am with 100% confidence that I saw this same creature with my own eyes. There's no mistaking a creature that looks just like this. Rippling muscles from head to toe, covered in dark fur, and a face half human, half canine. Before I get into that though, let me give you a little bit of a backstory so you can understand how my encounter happened. There is a tiny watering hole that's connected to a small creek that runs in between these mountains, and I visit them often to just go and relax, and sometimes I fish. I probably have visited this spot a few times a week, and for whatever reason, it was usually always dead. It wasn't completely hidden and out of the way. You had to walk off a small trail, about 10 minutes to get to it, but it was a wonderful spot. I've invited a couple of my friends over the course of the years and time to go to that same spot fishing. This time was no different. At least that's how it started out. I was by myself, and all I had was my rod and lures with me. I parked my car, and I walked into the trail a little way to get to the part where I need to walk off the trail. I made it to the watering hole, and as I'm setting up my rod to cast into the water, I hear movement directly in front of me on the other side of the watering hole. I look up, and I'm greeted with two striking red eyes looking dead center at me. Very intense. The first words that came to my mind were, "Uh-oh." This thing was a hulking beast and standing on two legs. It was using one arm to hold back part of the tree that it was stepping through, and the other part to hold on to another tree that was in front of it. I'm guessing it was coming to the area and just happened to peer right into this little clearing right where I am. The expression on its face read startled and surprised to see me there. I don't think it was expecting to come out of that forest with me standing there tinkering with my fishing rod. It stared at me for a brief moment, dead in my eyes. It didn't really seem angry, and it didn't seem like it wanted to attack me. In fact, I didn't feel any feelings of hostility. It felt more like an animal that had encountered a human being and was still in the moment, waiting and calculating on what to do next. After a moment of an intense stare, it slowly just backed right back into the woods where it came from, and I heard it walking off. I couldn't believe what I just saw. This was back in the spring of 1999, back when nobody really ever had information like they do now, like about cryptids and Dogman in general. I never have or seen or heard of this creature before, and hadn't even really heard of Bigfoot at the time, at least not to my recollection. That whole realm was all new to me. The only experience I had with anything not of this world was growing up. I was fairly certain that the house I had lived in was haunted, and I had some pretty severe experiences with that, but never did I imagine that monsters were actually a thing. I probably stood there in shock for a couple of moments, not sure what to do, and not sure what to feel. I wasn't petrified, but I didn't feel comfortable sticking around and pursuing my evening fishing. I had no idea if this thing had plans to come back, or what, so I left. For the next 3 to 4 weeks afterward, every time I thought about that same fishing spot, it would just bring that experience right back to my mind and make me not want to go anywhere. Finally, about 3 to 4 weeks later, I would say I was finally able to gather the courage to come back to that spot, but this time, earlier in the day. It was during the day, and on a day that I wasn't working, so I could afford to come before noon, versus the evening time. It was just as peaceful and quiet as ever, and I stayed there fishing until dusk. After that, I feel like that broke my fear of this creature returning. It is now 2020, 21 years since this incident, and I've still been back to that same fishing spot on and off frequently since then. Sometimes by myself, sometimes with friends, but I have never seen that creature again. I never told anybody about this, and even now there's seldom cryptid and Bigfoot researchers that I've shared my story with. Who's going to believe me that a canine humanoid creature popped out of the woods just to say hi? People want to judge you if you said you had a Bigfoot encounter, let alone a canine creature encounter. I didn't even realize at the time they were called Dogmen, and were a reoccurring cryptid that would come in the future. Had I ever seen this creature, and if you were to tell me about it now, I probably would laugh at you and say you were making it up. I'm only a believer because of my actual sighting. I've never needed or felt I needed to share my story with others just to feel validated. I 100% stand by and trust that what I saw is a real creature and is still a living, breathing animal nonetheless, no matter how horrifying it may seem. I share this with others because I hope they can find information that I share useful and potentially use it to plot out areas where this animal is or could be. By the way, this all took place in northern Idaho. The Chamberlain Basin, located in central Idaho in the White Cloud Mountains. Adventure awaits if you're a guide or the hiker hobbyist. But if you are like me and had a run-in with buffalo wolves, it's a place you want to stay far away from. Long story short, I do nature and landscape photography and videography. Most of my clients involve stock footage companies as well as some smaller, lesser-known magazines. I travel all around deep in the thicket, looking for some of the best shots and best videos I can get. Much of my work is actually on stock footage websites, but most of my work I sell privately. Before I tell anything about my story, I firmly believe that there is some supernatural quality to these animals. Coming from me, that's quite a big deal. I'm a firm believer in that there's nothing other than this life. I'm not a total atheist, but I'm pretty close to it. But I still consider myself somewhat agnostic. Now, let's ask the real question. Why do I believe there's a supernatural quality to these animals? Well, here's the thing. I'm a photographer, and after the run-in I've had with these buffalo wolves during this journey, I would like to think that I could have gotten a couple great photographs, right? No. This is a perfect example. I'm not sure what the phenomenon is, but there's something going on. The only conclusion I could possibly think of is magneticism, that these animals have a high amount of. I'm not sure how to explain it. The story goes like this. I was hundreds of yards away, taking photographs of these big elk, bull elk to be exact, wandering through this very large clearing, when out of the woods behind them came a pack of 4 wolves, larger than anything I've ever seen in my life. In fact, these wolves were so huge that they were actually just as large, if not larger than the bull elk, and were twice the speed. Before they even appeared, I'm taking snapshots of the elk, because I figured it would be good footage to use, and I had my special 300mm zoom lens. But as soon as these wolves appeared, my camera started acting funny and going crazy, malfunctioning. That's the best I can describe it to you. It was like it had severe water damage or something, freezing and hitting random things. I didn't notice right away because I was in awe of the creatures before me chasing down these elk and literally tearing them limb from limb. I'm tucked away behind some brush in a tree, so I'm not entirely visible to these animals. But not only am I scared, because I've never seen these before, but now I'm also freaking and panicking because my camera is deciding to go haywire. I felt like this was my one and only chance to get a picture of an animal nobody has ever seen before. I get it. By now, you're probably thinking I'm totally BSing you completely. I don't expect you to believe me, alright? But what I'm telling you is my truth and what happened to me. It didn't take more than a few seconds for these 4 wolves to close in on these 2 large elk and tear them apart, using their hands just like a person. The whole while I'm in awe, trying to make my camera work, but I keep looking up because I don't want to miss what's going on. This was a rarity in nature. These things were tearing massive chunks of meat off these animals, and in fact it seemed like the elk were being killed so fast, or dare I say eaten, they didn't look fully dead yet. It was grotesque. It was insane and terrifying all at the same time. All of a sudden, one of them looks over my direction, quickly followed by the other 3. They all stop eating and just stare right in my direction. Now I'm beginning to have a severe panic attack, thinking these things are going to descend upon me and tear me limb from limb like they did that elk. I know they couldn't actually see me because I was hidden behind some brush in a tree, but I wondered if I was upwind and they could smell me. I managed to successfully retreat far away from the area without these things ever moving towards my location. I was still able to keep sight of these creatures while they turned their back to their freshly killed meal. My camera was still rendered inoperable. In fact, for the next 2 days after, I couldn't get it to function properly, and I lost a couple days worth of work. Following that trip, about 200 plus pictures on my SD card became corrupted after that malfunction. I have no way to explain what happened or how it happened. I've never in my life had pictures on an SD card become corrupt or a camera malfunction in the way that it did, and I've been shooting professionally for years. The only other time I've ever heard of such a phenomenon happening is with UFOs and abductions. That's nothing to do with what I'm talking about today, but I've heard of this kind of thing happening. Do I believe that these were alien wolves that I saw because of their size? No. But how does this all of a sudden happen? And second, these things appeared out of the woods and chased the elk. Near the end of my trip, I had an experienced guide who goes to the area ask me if I got a chance to witness some of the largest wolves to ever roam the plains of America. He referred to them as buffalo wolves. He even told me that sometimes they'll stand up on their hind legs and act just like a person does. I never saw that, but he was not joking about their size. There's a reason they're called buffalo wolves, and I never knew they existed. In fact, if I ever brought it up to anybody, they have no idea what I'm talking about. Even Google supplies little information about these same creatures. I feel privileged that I got to witness such an animal living in the flesh, but I'm very disappointed that I lost out on money and my camera malfunctioned. Not to mention the overall experience and time was not worth it. I have no plans to ever go back or set foot in Idaho again. Around 1981, I was a kid in rural Montgomery County, Indiana. It was a perfectly clear day, and I was playing in the front lawn of my neighbor's house with my brother, Pat. My dad was an Indiana state trooper at the time. I think that's relevant because we had spent plenty of time around helicopters by that stage in our lives. I knew that these things could hover in place, made a lot of noise and wind, and I knew what they should look like. My brother and I both looked up. Over the left side of the roof of my neighbor's house, we saw 2 silver saucers. They were slowly rotating. We were perhaps 300 feet away. That's like what, 100 meters give or take? One was slightly higher than the other, maybe overlapping just a tad. We watched them for a few minutes, just sitting there. This was a perfectly clear sunny day. After some time, they both accelerated to a ridiculous speed toward the east. We ran inside and told my parents. Honestly, it was so insane that if my brother hadn't been there, and if my parents didn't recall us freaking out over these, I'd probably try and write it off as a dream. I've told my UFO story many times, but there's another part of it. I prefer to think this was a dream, but while I can no longer deny the existence of UFOs, this is a bit more sketchy. I was around 3 or 4, which is where most people stop listening, but my memories from that time in my life are so extremely vivid. Much of it feels like it happened a week ago. I got to bed one night, my security blanket at my side. Much like my iPhone these days, I wouldn't be caught anywhere without that blankie. It's a tad white trashy, but it had a cigarette burn on the edge of it, which for some reason I liked. I had a dream that night that was pretty vivid. I was in a large dark room. I don't recall being able to see the ceiling. I was walking along a walkway that had a railing, and along the sides and all over this room were holes in the floor. I recall convincing myself that things must live down in there, although I never did see anything. In front of me, and to the right, was a bright area with beings of some sort who were interested in me. I have absolutely no recollection of what they looked like. While walking toward that light, I dropped my blankie down in one of those holes on the left-hand side. Yeah, as you guessed it, that bit is going to be key later on. I recall feeling humiliated as these beings examined me. Yep, even the usual things that we heard about during the so-called child abductions, which I don't entirely want to spell out. I don't remember it being a very good time. I woke up the next morning, and my blanket was gone. I don't care who you are, you aren't going to forget that at any stage in your life. We looked everywhere for it. I had a history of sleepwalking, and our home was kind of small, maybe 1,500 square feet or so. I remember my parents looking everywhere for that blanket. It was just gone. It was a yellow blanket, and of course I needed a replacement. The replacement was blue, and my mom had to replace her signature cigarette burn. I'm a very skeptical person, and I really prefer to think that this was a dream. But the physical loss of a blanket and the actual UFO sighting my brother and I experienced around that time, I don't recall if it was before or after, makes things really hard not to tie together. It's the weirdest thing that has happened to me, and I'm alright with you not believing any of it. I toyed with the idea of a hypnosis, and may do. One night, I was coming home from work at about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. I live on a peninsula, so the road I was traveling down serves as the main throughout my area. As I am nearing the side street where I live, I approached a Baptist church. Immediately, I could tell there was something odd about the church, because the parking lot was dark when usually it was lit up. Instead, all I could see at first was a singular blinking red light, the kind you see on a phone tower, but the light was not blinking any ordinary fashion, as it did not appear to follow any kind of pattern. I slowed down as I neared it, because something hovering over the church caught my eye. The blinking red light appeared to belong to a giant airship that was hovering 150 feet above the steeple of the church. I was absolutely flabbergasted. I won't pretend to be some kind of expert on helicopters or planes, but the airship followed no traditional guidelines that I had ever seen before. I can't remember precisely what it looked like, but I can say this. It was long and cylindrical shaped. There was no identifiable front or back. The red light I mentioned earlier was in the middle. It did not have wings of any kind or rotary blades. It had large vent-like protrusions that had white light coming out of them. It made no identifiable noise and was idly hovering over the church. At some point, it began drifting to the side like a balloon. The phone I had at the time was a crappy BlackBerry with a 2-megapixel camera. I tried to get to the back of my car to grab my DSLR camera, but the moment I put it in park and started to turn around, the ship began to move. In what seemed like half a second, it had shot off to the west and was gone in the blink of an eye. I still have no logical explanation for what I saw. A couple of weeks after I saw the thing, I had an extremely vivid dream in which creatures crawled in through my window and tried to take me out of my bed. They were muttering in a weird language that sounded like shrieking and clicks. I'm confident that it was only a nightmare, but it seemed significant to mention anyway. It was about 4 years ago. My cousin and I came out of the woods after deer hunting, about 45 minutes before dusk. My uncle was also coming out of the woods at the same time. We met at his truck and just stood around, talking for a while. My cousin saw it first. There were 2 sets of 5 lights, each, hovering above the tree line, about half a mile away. One set would stay still, as the other would go down behind the trees. When it was at its lowest, you could hear a loud noise, one that I can't really describe to you. After the noise and the craft would return to the height of the other craft, it was just hovering. Craft 2 would then drop down and do the same thing. This went on for a good half an hour. All of us were just stunned by what we were seeing. The weirdest part was, above the crafts, high in the sky, about the level or higher than the planes fly, was a ring of lights, almost like planes circling at an airport. Eventually, the crafts just took off at an angle away from us and were gone, and the lights high in the sky were gone as well. We stopped talking about it because nobody simply believed us. This happened 7 years ago on the beach in Massachusetts. Me, my brother, and my cousin, and the girl I was with at the time were taking a night walk along the beach, as we often do, to see the stars. Having very little light pollution at the edge of the continent affords us a spectacular view, much more impressive than any we could find where we live. We had found a nice little spot, sheltered by rocks, to sit and soak up the sights, when my cousin and I spotted something off near the horizon. It was a bright light, nothing more, blinking on and off at regular intervals. My cousin and I debated what it was for a minute or two. I thought that it could have been a lighthouse because it was over land. The area we were on the bay side of the cape, which overlooks the entire inner ring of land. After surveying the surrounding lights from the building, etc., we concluded that it was far too high in the sky to be a lighthouse. The idea was that it was an airplane crossed our minds as well, yet it was stationary. There was no noise coming from it, although we may not have been able to hear it from several miles away. We didn't debate it for too long. It wasn't that interesting after all. There was nothing about it that said it wasn't something ordinary. So my cousin and I went back to chat with my brother and my girlfriend, who had been talking a few yards away. And now for the part I cannot explain. As we're in the middle of some of our regular banter, the three of them froze, jaws to the ground, looking behind me and up. At the same time, I noticed that my back had gotten instantly warmer. Turning to follow their stunned gaze, I looked up. Behind where I was standing, and nearly 100 feet in the air, hung a luminous orb, suspended silently in the air. People with lesser powers of observation could have merely described it as a light in the sky. Yet, I am here to tell you that this was infinitely more interesting than that. It was no ordinary light. I'm willing to bet that almost anybody old enough to know the difference is able to tell you what type of light is being emitted by any device or natural phenomenon. Even when not directly facing the light, most of us would be able to discern the difference between light cast by an incandescent bulb, lamp, or an LED laser, TV set, the sun, the moon, fire, you get the picture. This light had a quality that I have never seen before or since in this life. One more time, with emphasis. This light was like nothing I have ever witnessed on Earth before or since. It was incredibly bright, but it didn't hurt to look right at it, even though it was nighttime. It was bluish and gave off an energy that I could feel against my face, similar to the sun's rays. It looked liquid, almost alive, much like bioluminescence. Upon looking at it, any one of you reading this, no matter how skeptical, would have been stunned into silence. All four of us certainly were, and as we stood silent, this object was suspended above us and gawked. Finally, in my excitement and confusion, lifted a finger and pointed at this sphere of light, saying, "What is that?" at least half a dozen times. As on cue, this object did something even harder to describe. To put it simply would be saying that it faded out, but that would be ludicrous considering just how it achieved this act. It moved silently in a straight line towards us, above our heads, all the while fading out from existence. It wasn't so simple as merely fading out like a dimmer switch on the kitchen light. It wrapped the darkness of space around itself and moved and became a shadow where once it was light. Imagine taking a lit light bulb and dragging it across the surface of a pool of black paint, slowly submerging it all the while. That's the best way I can describe it. Did it phase out into another dimension? Who knows? Your guess is as good as mine. I'm just telling you what I saw. Once it had completely phased out, it did a loop and shot incredibly fast all the way back across the bay, where it continued to blink on and off at regular intervals. We sat and watched this for a while, now knowing for sure it was something extraordinary. Eventually, there were two. One would blink on, then the other one off. This spectacle went on all night. I fell asleep watching it out the window. They never came so close again, and in the years we went back to the beach, we never saw anything like it again. Every time I go back, I hope to pray to witness this again, promising myself that I will try and communicate instead of being completely flabbergasted. It was clear to me, and the rest of us present, but it was something that was under intelligent control. It wasn't very big, but it was big enough to fit one person at least. I leave it up to you to ask questions and theorize. It was an open forum, as I said. I cannot explain it without speculation and conjecture. I will say a few things that it was definitely not. It was not swamp gas. It was not a ball of lightning. It was not chain lightning. It was not a plane, a blimp, or a weather balloon, star, or a planet. It was something I have never seen before, and something I cannot explain. Every year, my family kind of goes redneck and gets together to shoot guns. I'm no gun expert myself by any stretch of the means, but I do like to shoot a rifle here and there. Well, about a month ago, in early July, right before the 4th, I had an experience with a creature that I cannot properly identify, and I need help. Since I am the youngest of 3 brothers, it is my job to help set up the shooting range. That means I have to go down there, set up the targets, and make sure the tires we have behind the targets are properly in place and routed down correctly. As I am down there, putting up the targets, the rest of my family is inside, waiting for me to finish the job, when off to my left in the woods, I hear a loud sniffing sound. You know how a dog makes that sniffing sound? It was that exact sound, but really exaggerated and very loud. I turned, and in the clearing of the trees was this large Doberman Pinscher-looking animal. It was a smoky black, with tall, cropped ears, huge teeth, and what I would describe as very striking yellow eyes. It had its head up in the air, and it was sniffing something. I don't know what it smelled. I was hoping it wasn't smelling me. This thing was also incredibly ripped. It looked like it was pushing weights on a Bowflex back in the woods or something. Completely overly muscled upper torso, with a thinner, smaller, dog-like behind area. I know the analogy might be stupid, but if you've ever seen Family Guy, there's a character whose name is Joe. He's in a wheelchair. He's incredibly ripped, but his legs are very small and petite. That's the best way I can describe the drastic look and change of this creature's body. Like this thing only ever built up the muscles in its front portion of body. As soon as I saw it, I was petrified, and I ducked down behind the large target, hoping that it would not see me. I sat there while I thought I was hidden, and I heard this sniffing sound a while longer, and then it ceased. It was probably a couple of minutes before I felt like I had the guts to even turn my head just to check. I saw that it was gone, and I took that opportunity to bolt for it back to the house. I never heard it as I left or walked away, so I really had no idea if it was still in the same spot or not, or if it would even chase after me. I wasn't going to risk finding out, if we're being honest with each other. I get to the back door, and my brothers begin questioning me why I have not put all the targets up yet, and I tell them simply that we can't shoot because there's a huge bear. I am then met with a billion questions of what do you mean there's a bear, blah 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 blah. I knew if I described them exactly what I saw, I would have been laughed at, so I just wrote it off as a big brown bear. After some thorough convincing, they seemed to believe me, and instead, we just gave up on shooting that day and decided to all go ATVing, off in a much different area far away from here. I don't know what it was I saw, but it was a humongous animal. The sight of it alone petrified me. It looked like it could have done some serious damage if it got a hold of somebody or something. So here's the million-dollar question. What exactly did I see? This happened 2 months ago when my aunt and sister came back from horseback riding, when they told me about something big following them home. Whatever it was spooked the horses badly. They were only able to catch a small glimpse of it through the trees, but this animal was paralleling them the entire way home, which was about a 3-mile trail that they took. The trail they take, which is right near the house, makes a larger horseshoe shape, and at the bend in the trail runs right along a large creek that flows through the entire valley. It's beautiful to hike and to ride your horses through, normally, having been on the trail only a few times myself. It had my sister really freaked out, and she felt terribly on edge almost the entire time back, feeling like something was watching her, just beyond the trees, following them all the way back. My aunt is pretty experienced in the outdoors, much more than my sister, and is able to keep grounded much easier. She ain't fazed by much. She's a pretty hardy woman, but even she admits her nerves were going the entire way back. She knows that if her horses are responding to whatever is around them, it's not just their imagination. What exactly it was is unclear. They only heard a noise like something big running through the trees and heavy breathing. At other points, they would hear grunts and even snarls nearby. My aunt told me that she said it sounded really big, like a bear or possibly a moose, but neither of those animals behave in such a manner. It sounded like it was on all fours, judging by the way it walked, and did not walk bipedally. The horses seemed really skittish and wouldn't walk anywhere near the edge of the trail where it hugged a small patch of grass, and then right where the trees were at. This animal, or thing, followed them closely, right beyond sight in the trees, all the way until the trail broke, about several hundred yards that led down into a small vale where my aunt's house is, and beyond that, the stables where they keep their horses. Obviously, if it really wanted to, it could have come out of the trees at any time and attacked them or the horses, but it chose not to. It kept purposefully hidden for some reason. Neither my aunt or my sister fully knows or understands why. There's no large predators in the area that behave this way, sound like that, or are as large as that sounded. Nothing added up, and it really made both of them rethink walking the horses on that trail, especially during that time. This happened at about 7 p.m. in the evening time. It was still bright out, but the sun was beginning to set, and it was starting to get dusk. No light visibility had lessened yet. They both tried to move faster on the bend back to the house. The climate is also very dry. In the summertime, it's rattlesnake country. With all the brush and rocks, it can be very dangerous to be out there by yourself stranded. The woods are full of white oak, pine, and fir, all littered throughout. They both said that it is one of the only times either has heard or dealt with such a thing. My father passed away in 2007, and ever since then, I inherited his house in Louisiana that is bordering right up against some swamp. The swamp goes on for about 5 miles and then butts right up against some hard pine wood. That goes on for a few more miles, and I'm not sure what that turns into, because honestly, I haven't explored far enough. What I can tell you is standing out on the back porch at night, you have a beautiful view of the swamp below you. I say below you because when you step off the back porch, the land is almost a hill and continues to descend into the swamp before you hit the marshy ground, and then it descends more into the water. Well, I like to sit out there at times, and more so at night, drink moonshine, and sometimes smoke a cigar, and I'm not lying to you. I've seen large shadows moving around in the swamps at night, just outside the light's reach. Before you go off saying that I'm probably seeing a Bigfoot and the shadows, what I've seen from the silhouette is something that resembles a dog on all fours, but just large. Listen, I understand that I'm making pretty drastic claims, but I'm telling you what my eyes make out to be a very large canine-looking animal, and for whatever reason, it continues to stay just beyond the full sight of light. Does it make me uncomfortable? Of course it does. I feel like this animal watches me. I'm not going to go all horror movie style on you and tell you that it stood up on 2 legs and tried to attack my house. But I do feel like whatever animal it is, I've never seen it before in my life. I don't live down here full time, but I do try and come down here as often as I can to honor my father. It never fails that it's out there watching me in the darkness. I know there are times that I'm out there, and even if I can't see it, I can feel the presence of this animal. The real kicker here is I don't know exactly what it is. I can only see the faint silhouettes, but I've seen this silhouette enough times to be able to accurately tell you it looks to me like a large canine, as I've stated to you previously. To my knowledge, there are no species of wolf that inhabit any swampland, but I'm no animal expert. The problem with that hypothesis is the silhouette is very large. If I'm able to put it in perspective with another animal, I would say it's even larger than a good-sized buck you would get in hunting season. That doesn't seem plausible, I know, but I've seen this figure moving enough times that I could tell you there is no being off on my size estimates. My eyes just don't play tricks on me. This is a large animal. It's very possible that maybe there's a specific species of wolf out here that have evolved over time to inhabit and live in segments of the swamp. It's the only thing that really makes sense to me. There's been a lot of areas in the state and swampland where development and construction alone have come in and, well, removed a lot of things. Everything here is practically untouched, and there's really not even any houses around me. Just swamp for the most part. It's too dangerous to go exploring down into the swamp, even during the daytime, with all the poisonous animals and alligators around. I don't have that much faith in the swamp to keep me safe, and after seeing the small amount of whatever animal this is at nighttime, you can count me out and I'll stay out. Now, I will say that I do listen to your channel often, because it helps me sleep at night, and I'm a fan of horror stories in general. But can I outright say that this is in fact a Dogman? I don't know. I always figured I would have a much better chance of seeing a Bigfoot than I would ever have a Dogman, but again, I don't know. Until I can get a spotlight on this creature and see it in the light for good, then I can't be 100% positive and make an accurate determination. Here's my worry. If I try and shine a light on it, I'm going to be provoking it in some way. And I honestly don't want to be dealing with some sort of swamp predator that's super intelligent, trying to hunt me down or break into the house that I'm in. I don't know if that's all the cryptid encounters that I've been listening to talking, or if that's a legitimate fear that I have. My gut just tells me to leave it alone, and let whatever animal that is be. I don't feel the need to prove the existence of anything. So with that in mind, I'm just here to share with you my experiences, and simply leave it at that. On a day after the snow had fallen, we went up hunting in Lake Hughes area in California. There were 4 of us hunting that day, my dad and myself, and 2 good buddies. Well, the deer hunting was not that good that day. So, one of my buddies said to us, "My wife's uncle is gone from his cabin and won't be back anytime soon. So, why don't we visit his land and just hang out and all have some lunch?" Well, he lives by Lake Hughes Road and close to where we were. We went over there and unlocked the gate as he had a key. We went in there and had brought some apples for lunch and all. We seen he had hogs and started feeding them these apples. After about a half hour of doing this, we heard the horses behind the house or cabin running around and making all kinds of noise. We could not see what was going on as the house was in the way. But man, were they going nuts. So we all said to each other, "Let's get over there and see what's up." We did, and could not see anything but the horses still going nuts and running in circles. We then looked over this fence and through a gate and seen these huge footprints and smelt something like a dog that's been wet and rotten eggs mixed. Well, the gate was locked, and he went inside the cabin or house and got a key for the gate. I went over to the prints, and I'm 6'5" at the time and weighed about 275 pounds. I have a shoe size of 15-4E. Those tracks were much bigger than my shoe, and they were made with some of them in the snow. I stepped next to them and could not press down and going that deep. I could maybe go 3/4 to a full inch down. These prints were 4 inches deep. They were also 2 to 3 inches longer than my foot, and much wider. Then, I tried to step that far with my step, and no way that I could. Then, we followed the tracks until they came to this really steep hill. There, this thing went up this hill on 2 legs and stepped high enough that even my good buddy, who was a bodybuilder in great shape, could not climb. I could not even lift my leg that far, and I was 16 years old and pretty limber. No man could lift their leg that high or step that far. Nowhere did we see any bear tracks, and even if we did, they don't walk that far on 2 legs. Whatever this was, it walked along this fence and turned and went back into the woods, and then up this very steep hill. It must have looked at the horses and maybe seen us feeding the hogs. I never seen it, but we got scared and left the ranch. I have told this story to a few people, and they look at me like it could be, but you can tell that they don't think this is real. But when you see things like this, you just know something is out there. Nobody could change my mind on this one, as I know what I have seen, and it is not a setup. Nobody knew we were going to his ranch, and the next ranch over, nobody was home either. So, the only thing that it could be is that it was real and not fake. Nowhere did we see any human footprints by any of these tracks or up that steep hill. I know something is going on up there. This was back in the year of 1976, in the wintertime, November to be exact, in the Los Angeles County. First, as a matter of background, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. It will help explain the delay in ever having reposted this. The sighting occurred about 3 months prior to my entering the United States Army. I served for 3 years as a paratrooper with top secret clearance. After my time in the service, I became a Los Angeles police officer. I did that for 13 years and am now a federal agent, working for an OIG out of Washington, D.C. With that background, you can probably understand my reluctance to discuss this sighting with too many people. It really boils down to a potential career killer. That being said, the incident did occur, and I remember it vividly. Many years after the event, I reconnected with my friend, the witness, and asked him to tell me the story as he recalled it. I wanted to check my memory and see if it matched mine. It did, to a T. Only a few months ago, I spoke with my brother-in-law, a witness after the fact. I asked him if he remembered the events, and he did. It should be known that he is not the kind of person that would buy into such a story. He had not been semi-involved. Anyway, this is what happened. My friend Craig and I were both 17 years old and waiting to leave for Army basic training. He was due to leave in June, and I would go in August of 1980. We were staying with my sister and brother-in-law at the time. They lived in a cabin in Green Valley, California. Craig and I enjoyed our last months as civilians in that area and used it to train for the difficult training ahead of us. We ran every day along the mountain roads and hiked the hills, trying to get into prime shape. In May, we decided to test ourselves and camp out for a full 7 days. We knew the perfect place for this would be what we called the old campground, because of its isolated surroundings and terrain that would be perfect for climbing and hiking. So, we packed up a week's worth of supplies, and though my sister Cindy and her husband Tom offered to drive us, we decided to act like soldiers and walk to the location. We did this with full packs. My sister and Tom advised us that they would check in on us at least every other day, and that they would bring us food and lemonade and such. Tom also offered to provide us with 2 weapons to be used for protection against any strangers that may try to harm us. After all, this was before cell phones, and we would be on our own big time. There was also a heavy rattlesnake threat in the area, so we happily took him up on the offer. Tom met us up at that area near the mine shafts later that day and gave us an M1 rifle and a 12-gauge shotgun, ammo for both. The dirt trail that leads off the main highway goes very far back into the mountains. In fact, were you to traverse it to its end, you would end up on what is known as Grass Mountain. Craig and I decided to get about 3 miles in and away from the highway, which was about a mile past what was once an old 1920s campground, and live deep in the bush like soldiers would. We found a great spot, next to a clear running creek, and set up our tent in the clearing that was there. This clearing was completely surrounded by thick woods. Then, night fell. As we lay in our tent talking by the light of flashlights, we both heard the very loud snap of deadfall in the woods behind the tent. We sat up, frozen and listening. We heard what sounded like a very large and heavy person slowly walking around our site, making no effort to conceal his presence. Judging from the loud sound of breaking sticks and brush, we were both scared that somebody was out there. We exited the tent, Craig with a shotgun and me with the M1. I started yelling very loudly, "Hey, we know you are there. We have guns and will shoot." Again, we heard the sound of somebody walking slowly, but methodically around from our left to right. We shined our lights in the direction but could not see anything but the trees and brush. We talked amongst ourselves, wondering if it could be a bear or something, but we decided that it was a person and not an animal. After much yelling and warning that we would shoot, I decided to fire a few rounds in the direction of the noise. How crazy that sounds now, and I did just that. I fired about 3 rounds into the trees, and the sound was unbelievable. The weapon blasted the sound and echoed into the night, roaring into the canyons and fading off into the night air. We stood in silence. To our utter disbelief and eventual horror, whatever it was, began to move again, still left to right, in a circle around us. What we both thought and discussed later was that no animal would have stuck around after that horrific noise of the M1. Most normal people would have not stuck around either. Whoever or whatever was out there not only stuck around, but appeared, from the casual sound of the slow walking, to be less than concerned about our weapons. We made a decision to vacate the area post-haste. Grabbing our coats, we climbed the embankment up the dirt road, carrying our weapons. We ran the entire way, about 3 miles more or less, back to the main highway. We spent a very long night curled up in a concrete drainage ditch, waiting for the sun to rise. Every hour or so, a lone truck would come by, and the sound of that brought us comfort. Again, it was a long night. The next day, we hiked back to the site, expecting to find our tent and all of our supplies missing. To our surprise, everything was as we had left it. Nothing was out of place. We gathered our things and hiked back to an open area of an old campground. We decided not to sleep in the tent because it limited our vision, and instead laid our sleeping bags out in the area, open above the creek. After a day of climbing cliffs and cooking and such, night fell again. That night, just as the sun set and darkness was beginning to fall, Craig and I were walking in the direction of the main road. We were looking for rattlesnakes because we had shot one earlier on the dirt road in the same area. As we walked side by side with me on the left, both holding weapons, we saw it. Standing just on the dirt road, facing us, was a Bigfoot. There can be no doubt at all about what I saw. We could see it was very clearly a Bigfoot. He was about 8 or 9 feet tall and stood with his left shoulder even with the edge of the trail. He was covered with dark hair and had long arms. We did not smell anything unusual, as I have since read about other sightings. The strange thing about him was the absolute indifference in his expression. He did not look threatening. He did not look scared. He just stood there looking at us, almost bored. I instinctively brought my right hand up against Craig's chest, and we both stopped dead in our tracks. We never took our eyes off the Bigfoot as we spoke. I said, "Do you see that? Are we seeing this?" And Craig said, What do we do? What should we do? We both started to walk backwards as we spoke, very slowly and involuntarily. The Bigfoot just looked at us for a few moments. Then, and I will never forget the detail of this, he just slowly and very casually turned to his left and began to walk into the forest. When he did that, Craig and I stopped and started talking over each other. Do we shoot it? Should we shoot it? What do we do? Do you want to follow it? As we talked, we heard a sound that we both immediately recognized from the prior night. The sound of the Bigfoot slowly walking deeper into the woods, breaking deadfall, twigs and branches as he went. We never did fire a shot or follow him. We stayed up late and slept in shifts at the campground and did not hear from the Bigfoot again. The next day, Tom came up with food and supplies. We ran to him and told him the details of what had happened. It was very clear by his expression that he did not believe us. We took him to the exact spot where we saw the Bigfoot, and we discovered a trail of giant footprints leading from the trail into the woods. Tom smiled and told us that we did a good job making them. We were so frustrated and begged Tom to follow the tracks with us. We all followed them, and they went into and across the creek. On the other side, we found a large red anthill with a footprint right on top of it. I asked Tom, how could we have done that? He just shook his head and smiled. We followed the tracks to a point where two large hills formed a valley that sloped upwards into the mountain area. The ground turned rocky, and the prints stopped. This is what happened. I have lived with this memory for many years. I am now 45 years old, and am less concerned about what people think of me in terms of this incident. It is a fact, and because of it, I know for sure that Bigfoot lives, or at least once lived, in the area in Green Valley, California. I don't know if this constitutes as a skinwalker or not, but I feel like my life is in danger. I live in a small house with my grandparents because they've lost everything once their health has started to go down the drain. So, it's become our responsibility, along with my parents, to take care of them until they pass. My father is German and Irish, and my mother is full-blooded Navajo. Her parents are also full-blooded Navajo, as expected. My brothers and sisters are half, but I am not Navajo at all. My father had a child before he met my mother, or my now stepmom. That child is me, so all of my siblings are about 5 years younger than I am. For the record, I still keep in contact with my real mother. Now, because my grandparents on my mother's/stepmother's side are full Navajo, they believe that they had brought bad luck with them, and they are followed by a being of evil. They speak Navajo very well, and I can't speak a drop of it to save my life. My stepmother, who I'll just refer to as my real mother, because we're so close anyways, can speak it well. She has a knack of not letting me know exactly what's going on. So the first time I was relayed this information, I kind of chuckled to myself and thought, what, like a poltergeist? I knew nothing of what a skinwalker was, and the time it didn't take long before I learned what it actually was. A couple of months ago, my grandparents began to get really sick, and they lost everything they had, which is why they are living with us. But I feel like they brought something with them. My grandmother has had a being that has been plaguing her now, and it has been now drawn to her house. During the daytime, you can sometimes see this tall black figure wandering around in the distance that kind of looks human, but it doesn't quite look all the way human. It's an entirely black figure, and there's no real shape or detail to it. It's as creepy as it can get. If my grandmother sees that, she freaks out and claims that's the creature that's haunting her. It never comes anywhere close to her house though, or our house during the day at least. I haven't had any issues with the creature at night, nor have I ever seen it up close. But I will say this, all throughout the night, I have these horrible vivid nightmares of a creature stalking our house, trying to get in, trying to get my grandmother. These nightmares occur all night long and have been happening since they moved in a couple of months back. It's every single night. There is no break. It seems to be the same reoccurring themes over and over again, spanned across several reoccurring nightmares. I'm not brave enough to get up in the middle of the night to look out the window to see if these are actually real or not, and frankly, I don't want to. Being brave doesn't get me anything in this situation, except terrorized. Once the sun goes down, the feeling and the atmosphere change. You don't feel safe anymore. We all feel that. You begin to feel on edge, like there's something that's going to happen, but never does. I don't know if I'm supposed to be waiting around for this thing to try and get into the house, or what's going to happen. Does it just want my grandmother, and then it's going to leave us alone? Does it want all of us now that we're with her? I don't even know who to talk to, or who to go with my questions. I haven't really sat down and done any research like I probably should have, but I guess I should, since there are resources out there. I figured sharing my situation first is probably my best bet, as I would prefer real human feedback before I just started looking for answers. So let me ask you this, what lurks beneath. Have you had any personal experience with an entity that resembles what I am speaking of? Am I crazy, and is it all in my head? Do you feel like there's any truth to my situation? And if so, what is it that I should do? We live about 100 miles outside of the res to the west, and I always thought that skinwalkers were only on the reservation. But if that's what this thing really is, then I guess I'm wrong. Thanks for any feedback I can get. Living out in Arizona, I can describe it in one word: crazy. I don't live super far away from the Apache National Forest, and so there's an area behind my house that's heavily forested, and not so much dry desert like much of the state is. Unbeknownst to many people, a lot of the state has dense forest and rich greenery. It's not all just dry desert like many think it is. Anyway, I moved in here at the beginning of the year, and it's been a hell of an experience, let alone the whole 2020 thing and COVID and all that. Before I tell you about the things I've been experiencing and have seen, I haven't actually physically seen any creature with my eyes, but I've seen evidence of whatever animal or creature this could be, and I've certainly heard things off in the distance. We'll start with the dead animals. Over the past year since I've lived here, there have been dead animals showing up left and right around the backside of my house. It's not just the fact that they are dead animals, it's the fact of the matter in which how they died. Surprisingly, there's been about 3 or 4 dead doe that just look like they dropped dead. Except for one thing. They're ripped open. Always the same way, in the same spot, with their entrails and guts completely missing. No signs of them being eaten or torn at anywhere else on their body. There's no missing eyeballs, no chunks of meat taken out of their necks or back, nothing. There's no signs of a predator grabbing them and pulling them away to be eaten on. Just ripped open right at their gut and everything missing. It's beginning to freak me out, is what it's doing. At nighttime, and only at night, I'll hear these weird screaming sounds. It sounds like a woman being murdered far up in the woods behind me. I know cougars can make sounds like a woman being murdered as well, but this sounds much louder and lower in pitch, and the timbre sounds different. Maybe I can try and get a recording of it sometime so I can send it to you, so this way you can know what I mean. This is still going on. I'm writing this to you on August 5th, 2020, and as of now, I am still experiencing all of these things. They have not stopped. Sometimes I'll hear a voice that I don't quite recognize, but it sounds like a young woman calling my name outside. I don't know what on earth it could be, or who is out there calling my name, but I don't feel good about any of it. The first few times I was wondering if I was going through a psychotic episode, and then the next few times it happened, I wondered if it truly could be something evil. I do believe in supernatural and evil creatures that live out in the woods, and even more so now that I'm actually experiencing them firsthand. I told a few of my friends, some of them who are natives, and they tell me that I need to go get blessed right away, because I'm dealing with something serious. My one friend is very stern and tells me to not blow this off. You are being hunted. Hunted by what? If it's a creature, then I could assume it is some sort of animal, and that means it can die if I pump enough bullets into it. I'm heavily equipped and ready. It might sound weird to me that I hear somebody calling my voice outside my house, and I'm not acting freaked out, but believe me, it scares the living hell out of me. But I choose to ignore it the best I can and keep all my weapons armed, locked, and loaded. If it comes anywhere near my house, which it has not yet, I won't hesitate to put a whole clip into it, whatever it may be. The same friend who told me that I'm being hunted, he's a great friend of mine, and he's full Apache. He's the one who told me that I chose the wrong place to move where my house is, like it's really my choice. Tons of people in the area are also experiencing paranormal and bizarre things similar to what I am. I asked him about the dead animals being ripped open and their guts being removed, and he says it's the same creature that is stalking me and hunting me. I was reluctant to believe any of it at first, but it seems like there's some horrifying truth, and he's not the type of person to make anything up like this. He's not really an imaginative guy anyway. His whole family has warned him of the same thing, and even he stays out of certain areas because he does not want to attract the wrong energy towards him or his family. I wondered for a while if it's anything I did, maybe spewed out a negative word or energy, or that it's strictly my location. Whatever creature this is strictly territorial, and I just so happen to be living in a spot that is a part of its hunting territory, or so I'm told. I guess it's pretty bad when even a lot of the Apache tribe doesn't want to deal with it because they consider it too dangerous. I'm considering moving now because I don't know how long I'll be safe here, even though I have ample firepower to deal with the situation at hand. What are your thoughts on my situation? I know you get dealt with a lot of Skinwalker stories and Dogman accounts. Do you think what I'm dealing with here could be a Skinwalker or something else? I am definitely concerned that Apache tribesmen are telling me I need to be concerned because I'm being hunted. Those people know the outdoors like none other, and if they are telling me that what I'm dealing with is dangerous, then I should probably listen. I'm far too stubborn and prideful to give up my house and change locations, but now I'm starting to wonder how much torment do I need to endure before I listen. I had an encounter with something horrifying along the river. I was with my brother at the time, and we both saw this creature. It looked like a man, but it wasn't a human. It did have a muzzle, but the skin on its face didn't have any fur on it. It did have thick black fur though, all over its body, except for its face, which had dozens of sharp teeth popping out of its mouth. It was this horribly disfigured looking creature, if I've ever seen one. We spotted this creature, and we stopped in our tracks. We were walking down this small segment of the creek to skip rocks and hang out together for the afternoon. Then, my brother spots this dark shape that doesn't look like it should be there. He points to it and nudges me on my shoulder to get my attention. You see that? I see this shape. What actually was this creature that was hunched over close to the water, partially blocked by some larger stones. It turned around to see us. It stood up. It stared at us intently before quickly jumping off down the creek, crashing through the trees. Then, this thing comes crashing back out of the woods, with 3 of the same creatures following right behind it, straight in our direction. We were now being chased by whatever the hell you'd call these things. They were running on 2 legs, like a human. They looked so scary. All of this happened probably within a 10-second span of time from it running into the forest and then running back at us. We were scared as hell and turned and ran for our lives. We ran all the way back home, which was a good 2-mile trek. We didn't seem to be followed by this creature. I didn't know what this was, and I've been at that creek numerous times. My brother and I both have. We ain't ever seen something like this before. It's virtually unheard of. I don't know if there are some sort of deformed mutant wolves out there, but man, that's a nightmare I don't ever want to revisit. I'm just telling you that right now. Okay, this just happened to me last week. I'm still shaking about it, and I've decided to go against what I've been told and speak up on the issue. Here I go. I got home to my house late one night, about 5 days ago, when I noticed something trotting across the street from the forest up to the back of my car. I turn to look, and I see tall ears and red, glowing eyes. I about dropped my backpack and nearly had a heart attack. What is this thing? I thought to myself. I was frozen in place and couldn't even move to turn to get into my small house. Then, this thing, this horrible creature, stood up from behind my car and started walking towards me. I was looking at a real-life werewolf in the flesh from what I could see. It stood and walked just like a man, but its legs and arms were covered with thick, matted fur, just like the rest of its body. But those parts of its body seemed to have little tufts of hair that kind of almost glistened in the small amount of light given off by the nighttime. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could make out the horrible eyes, and then it had a huge, huge mouth filled to the brim with teeth. I could clearly see 2 rows of razor-sharp teeth coming out from behind its lips. It was beginning to snarl at me as it raised its hands out to me, as if it was reaching for me. This was hands down the most terrified I think I've ever been in my entire life, and I've almost nearly drowned a couple times, but that's a different story. In that moment, I experienced extreme fight or flight. I regained my senses somehow, turned around, grabbed hold of my door handle, and thank God, conveniently I had forgotten to lock it this time when I went out, and flew through the door. I slammed it shut, locked it, and ran to call the police, only after grabbing the biggest knife that I have. I just hoped that the thing couldn't break into my house. I phoned the police and told them what had happened. I had told them I was being attacked by somebody, and this person was being aggressive and trying to break in. They said they would send someone out and that they were on their way. I began to calm down a little. My heart was beating so hard out of my chest, and I was having a hard time catching my breath. The creature was adamant about getting to me. It was trying to claw its way into the house, clawing away at the front door, wiggling the handle violently. The only thing more frightening was that it knew what a door handle was and was trying to open it. So far, it wasn't working. It would just howl in frustration and bang on the door with its whole body, like it was trying to break the door down. After about 5 minutes, which felt like hours, the police had finally arrived. They took one look at the creature trying to get in the house and drew their guns. "Take cover," one of them yelled, I remember hearing. Then, this creature let out a powerful roar that seemed to shake the house to its very foundation. It sounded so loud that it was almost painful to hear. It almost seemed to shake the doors off their hinges. The 2 cops closest to the door raised their guns and began firing. I was hiding in the kitchen, right behind the counter at this point, but I could hear and see the bullets doing nothing against this creature from my window. It kept roaring as it began moving towards the back of the house, where the sliding glass door was. Then, one of the cops started chasing after it, and both cops ran after the beast, heading towards the back of my house. I don't know if this thing was retreating or what it was doing. The creature was struck in the back by bullets, and it seemed to only flinch slightly, but kept on going towards the house. The cops were now about 20 feet away from the back door. One of them raised his gun and fired. The bullet entered this creature's back, but it still did not stop. It kept on coming, and the cop just barely managed to shoot it in the head with his gun before it reached the back door. It was so close that its blood splattered against the door, and it started dripping down to the ground. It was a mess, and I was in hysterics. The beast was still flinching on the ground, and the police had finally done their job. In the wake of all this civil rights justice, this seemed to be fitting for a duty of their stature. Just in that moment, all three of us heard the loudest howl that came from far beyond the woods on the far backside where I live. I just stood there, staring at this big bloody body of a creature for a few moments. I was entirely numb, physically, emotionally. I just shut down. I was in shock. This creature was huge. Now, the story begins to take a much darker turn. So, I don't own this house. I rent it out from an older man who owns several houses in the area. The back part of this property goes up in a slight incline to these large segments of woods, which also backs up against several other houses in the same neighborhood, all owned by the same gentleman. Within 10 minutes, I want to say a large military black helicopter descends down right in my backyard, and about 6 to 7 secret agent-looking men wearing unidentified uniforms and dark suits come swarming up to my house, and the 2 officers who were there for the kill stayed right alongside with me. They quickly escorted the officers away, and I only heard parts of their conversation, telling the officers that they no longer had jurisdiction over this case, and it was now property of the federal government. Frankly, I can't recall their banter because my mind kind of blocked that and all the trauma out. Then, they looked down at the body, and some of the men began trying to take the body back towards the chopper. The other couple of men demanded I open my back door, threatening me with detainment and worse. Once I gave in to their demands, they started asking me question after question after question. This went on for maybe an hour, if not a little more. Then, sometime in the middle of questioning, I see the 2 officers that responded to my call initially, who assisted me, were in handcuffs and being led into this large black chopper, along with the bloody, pulverized body of this horrific creature. The lead man questioning me, which by the way I thought was weird and creepy, that he never took his glasses off, and it was nighttime, told me that he would come pay me a visit tomorrow. He just left like that, and they all got in the chopper and flew away like nobody's business. My brain, in complete and total shock, didn't sleep at all that night. I was traumatized, in complete terror, and had no idea what had just transpired. I laid awake in my bed all night long, with a knife still close to my bed, just in case anything happened. When I got up, I noticed the police car in front of my house was gone, that was initially left there last night after the other 2 officers were detained. Any blood that poured out of the creature was also gone. The splatters, the markings. There were no signs of anything. That's when I all of a sudden heard a very firm, stern knock at the door. I opened it, and it was the gentleman who I spoke to late last night. He gave me a quick, fake greeting, and began asking me questions again, forcing his way into my house, into my personal bubble. To say I felt violated and uncomfortable is an understatement. This was a full-on interrogation, or so I felt. When I would in turn ask him questions, like, who are you? What government branch do you represent? Who do you work for? How did you get here? He would answer them with questions for me, or would just ignore them altogether. I got a really bad vibe from him. His questioning was very aggressive, and started talking about things in my personal life that only I know about. Then, he threatened me with blackmail if I ever told a soul about any of the events that had transpired last night and today. I spat right in his face, literally, and told him to please leave my house. Look, obviously I said it in a much more colorful way, with using more colorful words, as you can imagine. But for the sake of the story and typing it out, that's what I did. He left without saying anything. I had no idea where he came from, because I saw no cars out of anywhere, no helicopter, nothing. Anyway, I know this story may not seem like it makes much sense to you, but this has had me freaked out, and I don't care. They can do whatever they want to me. take me out for all I care. I don't think they're going to do anything serious, especially if I share this story. Let's see them do something though. They have bigger fish to fry with the whole COVID thing. Let them. I don't care anymore. Hopefully my story can get out, and maybe, just maybe, we can turn the tides for good. It was unusually warm to be mid-December on this day, and me and my buddy were hunting in an area known as Chiloe. It was about an hour before sunset when we climbed out of our deer stands. I met my buddy in a little holler, about 100 yards away from both of our tree stands. We were walking back to the four-wheeler when we heard a very low rumble in the holler that we had just met in. We were now at this time about 35 yards from the holler, almost in a field. So we thought we would be real still and sit on the edge of the field for a minute and see if we could hear anything else. At this time, we were thinking it was just a grunt or a blow from a deer that had scared. We waited probably 10 minutes before we heard a loud splash in a little drinking hole. Me and my buddy looked over at each other and said, "What the hell is that?" So we waited another minute, still hoping that a deer would come out. Then we heard a second splash. At this time, we realized it was not a deer. So we walked probably 20 yards and saw what we believe was to be a big hairy beast. It was approximately 8 feet tall and around 350 pounds. Me and my friend were almost in shock at what we had seen. This Bigfoot creature saw us and actually didn't even seem to care that we were watching it. It just kind of lingered there in the area for another minute before walking over a small ridge where we lost sight of it. And to be honest, he kind of just lingered there around the area for another minute before walking over a small ridge where we lost sight of it. And to be honest, we were too scared to go and look for it. So we went back to the house and told everybody there. But they said we were crazy and that it was just a bear. I've been hunting bear for years and I am familiar with their movements. This was no bear. I know this because it never dropped down on all fours of its feet the whole time we watched it, and we probably saw it walk a total of 30 to 40 yards, but I am 100% certain that it was no bear. It was some sort of human-ape creature. I am positive. So is my buddy. Back in the summer of 1995, myself and 4 friends were camping at the base of a mountain in our town in eastern Tennessee. Normal night with our friends until the campfire died down. We were on an old road bed and had been breaking all kinds of dead trees for fire. As we were doing this, a lost hunting dog came to us. When it did, we gave it some peanut butter, and the poor starving thing ate, and then carried off the plastic jar. We didn't think anything else of him until a few hours later. The fire began dying down, and me and 3 of my friends were sitting, leaning against the embankment as the dog came running back to us, shivering. Well, we were all kind of like, what the hell? I'm getting chills as I type this. We were looking in the direction where the dog came from, and we saw this large dark shadow just out of sight, and just out of the light. Just out of our clear vision from the fire. Me and all my friends froze. The dog was whimpering, and that's not normal for a coon dog. We saw the shadow turn towards us, and we all saw the reflection of its eyes. It paused to look for all of us for 45 seconds, and then, like it was shot out of a cannon, this loud sound like it was running through the woods, breaking trees at this point. Fear had overwhelmed all of us. We had been in the area of woods many times over the years, built large fires as large as we could, and none of us slept the rest of that night. When we saw what we considered to be a Bigfoot, there was this terrible wet animal smell. It was unmistakable. To this day, I have never smelled an animal like it since. Approximately 3 to 4 years later, me and one of the guys were at the top of the mountain, not far from there, at a large natural sand cave and a large waterfall. We got bored as people do that age and went to the top of the sand cave to sit at the edge of the waterfall. As we climbed up to the top, we had that same smell hit us, and that same type of destruction was present. Trees about 3.5 to 4 feet up were just broken off, like the first time we ever encountered this. We looked around and followed the path as far as we could until it ran out. We all still talk about this to this day, and we all get cold chills when we do. My wife was going to work around the end of July in 2002 and saw something by the side of the road. It was tall and dark colored. She slowed down because she thought it was somebody who might have broken down. The thing was at the edge of the road near a creek. As she stopped, it crossed the road and leapt onto a dirt bank about 5 to 6 feet off the road and went into the woods. A day or two later, as she was going to work, she saw something standing by the edge of the road in the same area. It was tall and dark with reddish eyes. It made no effort to come into the road and went back into the woods. All of these events occurred during the early morning hours on a remote section of mountainous road in Stony Creek section of Carter County on Highway 91. On August 1st, 2002, I was letting my dog out of the house because I thought he had to go to the bathroom. My female dog would not leave the house, and my male dog went onto the porch and stared at a field adjacent to my house. This was 3 in the morning. He would not leave the porch, and his ruff was up, and he would growl really low. I looked around and saw something in the field, about 2 o'clock from my elevated position. I could not get a direct look at what it was, but it was large enough to be seen bent over in a field of nearly mature untopped tobacco. When it realized it was spotted, it made a chuffing noise, between a growl and a guttural throat sound. At this time, I noticed another figure in the field moving off into a shadowy area between a barn and a road behind my location. This was a smaller version of what was in the field near me. The thing in the field, from me, stayed there until the thing that had crossed the road made a similar chuffing sound. The dogs behind my location and in the area where this was happened were barking. The thing in the field then began to move through the tobacco field to the tall grass and finally to the tree line. I also heard a noise like something in pain, something small. This was followed by 2 additional series of sounds coming from an area near the creek across the road from us. This was answered by the things that had crossed through the field at my location. The only thing I got a good look at was a rounded back covered with a brownish red or light brown fur. This again happened at night, and the lighting was not bad. There was also partial moon and ambient light from the property nearby. I checked the area when I observed the things in the following morning, and found areas of mashed up grass and trails that roughly followed the sounds I had heard the previous night. What was unusual was that I got the impression that there was a young animal of some kind hurt. It was a mewling sound that was kind of scared that I heard the area of the second thing. I did not find any footprints that could properly be identified. I did find depressions in the grass and trails through, and the still wet grass where something had moved. I also was surprised that the things seemed to communicate with each other. One of the things that is not seen or seemed to be angry or upset about something. Also, the things that did not cross the road but stayed in or around the creek seemed to be looking for something. They even went so far as to climb or attempt to climb a tree. My wife and I noticed a tree by the creek moving and swaying as if somebody were climbing it. There was not enough wind to move the tree, and there was also a strong musty odor when the breeze changed and blew in our direction. August of 1984. When I was about 15, 3 of my friends and I were camping in the woods above my house. We had 2 dogs, a collie and a female husky. We had built a lean-to and to sleep under it. We were just talking about things, girls and such, when one of my friends let us know that he heard something. We just laughed at him. About 2 or 3 minutes later, 2 of my friends claimed to have heard the same noise as the 2 of us that did not hear it. So, we started making fun of them. About 5 minutes after that, our dogs began pacing back and forth, acting strange. Then, all at once, a loud yell came from behind the lean-to, and it shook hard. I could see it visibly shaking. We all ran, except for one, and he froze and could not move. We ran through the pitch-black woods, hitting trees and running through briars. When we got out of the woods, we turned and noticed that our friend was not with us. We yelled for him, and about 2 minutes later, he came out of the woods, carrying his collie in his arms. I never knew what that thing was, but my friend said that he could not see it, but that he could hear it behind him, making a grunting sound as he sat in front of the fire, and he could hear it behind him, walking as he walked out of the woods, some distance behind him. We went back the next day with an adult to retrieve our sleeping bags and things that our lean-to had been torn down. The rocks we had for the fire pit were scattered. The whole area smelt 10 times worse than a wet dog.